Hey guys, tonight, our story will drift along the quiet trail of the Black Death, when it arrived not with thunder, but with a knock at every door in town. There are no grand triumphs to chase, no tangled riddles to solve, just the soft unfolding of a time when silence grew louder than life itself. If this gentle journey brings you comfort, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. I always love to see where in the world you listen, and the hour at which you drift off. Share your peaceful place in the comments below if you wish. It is the year 1347. In the quiet, bustling towns and villages of Europe, life proceeds at its usual pace, unhurried by the ambitions of kings or the whispers of distant events. Markets teem with merchants, the sound of hammers and axes fill the streets of the blacksmiths, and farmers till the soil, hoping for a good harvest. The world is small, and most people live within the confines of their immediate surroundings. News travels slowly, carried on foot or by the occasional messenger. But soon, a new kind of news will begin to spread, a news no one can outrun no matter how fast their feet can carry them. It begins, as all great upheavals do, in a faraway land. The bustling trade routes between the east and west, once full of merchants with their goods from far-off lands, now carry something far more dangerous: death. In the great cities of the East, on the shores of the Black Sea, the merchants and sailors of the time had little idea that their trade would soon carry with it something far worse than precious spices or silks. On the shores of the Crimea, in the bustling port city of Kaffa, a deadly illness begins to spread. It is nothing like the sicknesses people are accustomed to: a fever, a cough, a rash. No, this is something different. By now, the year 1347 has already seen strange reports coming out of Asia. In China, a deadly illness is creeping through the countryside, followed closely by waves of death. Those who fall ill rarely recover. Entire villages are wiped out, leaving only empty homes and overgrown fields. But for most Europeans, these distant events remain a mystery. The plague, as they will soon come to know it, does not yet have a name. No one has yet seen the enormity of what is coming, but there are signs, disturbing whispers that travel across the Mediterranean Sea. As the disease spreads through the Eastern world, it eventually reaches the Black Sea ports. The first whispers of the plague come from those who have crossed paths with its wrath. It is called the pestilence, but no one truly understands its origin. Some say it is a divine punishment, sent by God for humanity's sins. Others whisper that it's a curse carried by the wind or the waters. The Italian merchants from Genoa, who have established a stronghold in the port city of Kaffa, have heard the stories. They've heard rumours from the east, stories of entire cities falling silent as the plague spreads, of the dead lying unburied in the streets, of bodies tossed into mass graves. But this is a distant world, and surely these events are not yet close enough to touch them. Kaffa, and the city sitting on the edge of the Black Sea, is teeming with merchants from across the Mediterranean. Genoese merchants trade in spices, grains and wool. Their ships dock at the port and they speak in quick tones, discussing their goods and plans. But there is a new noise now, a silence that is spreading faster than any merchant could have imagined. It is in the quiet whispers in the alleys, in the hushed words exchanged between sailors who have just returned from the east. As the first waves of the plague begin to sweep through the city of Kaffa, fear takes root. The sickness spreads rapidly. People are taken down with fever, chills and swelling of the lymph nodes. Their skin turns a sickly shade of black as the disease works its way through their bodies, suffocating them from the inside out. It is clear now that this is no ordinary sickness. This is something else, and it is spreading like wildfire. The Genoese merchants, caught in the web of a city that is quickly being consumed by death, make a decision that will alter the course of history forever. As the death toll rises in Kaffa, the city becomes a ghost town, empty except for the sick and dying. Those who can, flee. But for the merchants of Genoa, there is little choice but to retreat. They are trapped by the quarantine that has been imposed on the city, unable to leave, but eager to escape the grip of the disease. In their desperation, the Genoese merchant fleet takes a dangerous gamble. They load their ships with goods, with men, and with what little hope they have left. They leave the harbour of Kaffa, sailing away under the cover of darkness, determined to return to their home port in Genoa. But little do they know, the death that has consumed Kaffa is not finished yet. It has hitched a ride on the ships, an invisible, insidious passenger that will carry the plague across the Mediterranean, bringing it to the shores of Europe. The ships set sail, their sails catching the wind, heading westward and toward Genoa. As they travel across the calm seas, the sailors, unaware of the silent terror now aboard their vessels, go about their daily routines. But the sickness is patient. It waits. The Genoese sailors, who have been close to the sick in Kaffa, begin to fall ill, one by one. The sailors aboard the ships begin to experience the same symptoms that devastated Kaffa: fever, chills, and painful swelling. The ships, once full of life and activity, now carry the dying. One by one, the ships reach port. Genoa, with its busy harbour, is a major trade hub. It is a city that is always on the move, always bustling with activity. But this time, something is wrong. The ships return, and with them the plague. The first death comes silently, like the flicker of a candle before it is snuffed out. And soon, many follow. The first signs of the plague that will devastate Europe have arrived. In Genoa, the disease spreads with terrifying speed. The city becomes a graveyard, its streets filled with the wails of the dying and the groans of those who will soon join them. People begin to realize that this sickness is unlike anything they have ever seen. It spreads quickly, it is deadly, and it is unrelenting. The ships, once thought to be harbingers of fortune, have become vessels of doom. Genoa, a city of power and wealth, is soon gripped by fear, its thriving trade and commerce grinding to a halt as the plague begins its relentless march across the city. No one is safe, rich or poor, merchant or peasant. The plague spares no one, regardless of their status. As each day passes, the toll becomes more apparent. The people of Genoa begin to panic, and the realization sets in that the death that has followed them from the east is now a part of their world, or a reality they cannot escape. In the narrow, crowded streets of Genoa, panic is contagious. At first, it begins with whispers, rumours that the sickness is spreading. People talk about the ill and the dead, the bodies piled up in houses, unburied because there is no one left to care for them. But as the number of the afflicted grows, it becomes undeniable. The city is under siege. It is no longer a matter of gossip. It is life and death, and the fear that permeates every corner of the city takes root in everyone's heart. The disease spreads through the narrow alleys, through the crowded marketplaces, and into the homes of those who had once felt invulnerable. The poor, who have always lived in cramped quarters, are hit hardest. They have no way to escape, no safe place to hide from the invisible enemy that has taken residence in their midst. And even the wealthy, with their grand houses and well-stocked pantries, are not spared. The plague doesn't care for wealth or power. It strikes with equal ferocity, whether you have a fortune to protect or a meagre existence to defend. As the plague spreads, people begin to notice the strange way it attacks. The first signs are subtle: swollen lymph nodes, fever and chills. But soon the symptoms worsen. Dark, discoloured patches appear on the skin, especially around the armpits, groin and neck. The skin darkens as if bruised, and the victim's breath becomes laboured. The agony is swift, often claiming the victim's life within a matter of days. The world of the living is being overtaken by the world of the dead, and there is no escaping it. Fear turns into chaos. In the panic, neighbours turn on one another, stores are abandoned. Street corners that were once full of merchants haggling over goods are now empty, save for the occasional passer-by, their faces covered with cloth to protect against the sickening stench of death that now fills the air. People barricade themselves in their homes, praying that the plague will pass them by, but it doesn't. It lingers, lingering in every shadow, every corner, in the air itself. As the disease spreads, those who have the means to flee do so. The rich, those with enough wealth to escape, board the first available ship or mount their horses and ride as fast as they can to the countryside, hoping to outrun the plague. But the plague follows. It rides the winds, carried by fleas that jump from rats to humans, moving swiftly across the land. It travels with merchants, with soldiers, with travellers. There is no escape. The plague does not need roads. It does not need to wait for the next caravan. It simply moves, spreading from city to city, town to town, leaving destruction in its wake. In Genoa, the city is soon overwhelmed. The streets, once teeming with life, are now deserted. The marketplaces are silent. The once bustling harbour, full of ships coming and going from all corners of the Mediterranean, is now eerily still. Only a few ships remain, docked and abandoned, their cargo forgotten. And in the empty houses, the sick remain, waiting for death to come. The authorities are powerless to stop the spread. Medical knowledge in 1347 is rudimentary at best. No one understands the true nature of the disease. Some believe it is God's punishment for the sins of mankind, others believe it is a punishment sent from the devil. But whatever the cause, there is no remedy, no cure. The sick and the dying are left to fend for themselves, and as they fall, others take their place. The cycle continues, and with each passing day, the plague claims more lives. Genoa, like all cities in the path of the plague, falls into a strange kind of paralysis. The living are too afraid to move, and the dead are too numerous to bury. The plague has taken control, and all that can be done is to watch, helpless, as it spreads. By the time the plague has reached Genoa, it is already too late to stop its spread. The seeds of destruction have been sown, carried not just by the Genoese merchants, but by every ship, every person, every merchant, and every soldier who has come into contact with the infected. The plague, with its silent, invisible march, moves swiftly across Italy and toward the rest of Europe. It spreads north, west, and east, following the same route that merchants and pilgrims have travelled for centuries, and with each passing day it grows stronger, more insidious. In Florence, just a few weeks after the first cases are reported in Genoa, the city begins to feel the weight of the plague's arrival. By the time the first death is recorded, it is no longer a single isolated incident. It is part of a terrifying pattern that is unfolding across the continent. Like the air itself, the disease seeps into the very fabric of life. The once vibrant city, filled with the sounds of trade, music, and laughter, becomes eerily silent. The streets are abandoned, the marketplaces are empty, and the sound of a bell tolling for the dead becomes a common sound in the air. Florence, a city known for its art, culture, and commerce, is suddenly consumed by fear. The death toll rises swiftly. The plague ravages the people in a way that they had never experienced before. Families are wiped out in a matter of days, entire households struck down, leaving only empty rooms and silent streets behind them. The rich, who once lived in grand homes, find themselves just as vulnerable as the poor. The disease knows no class, no social status, and no amount of wealth can protect you from its reach. The fear of the plague is not limited to the towns and cities along the Mediterranean coast. As the disease spreads north, reaching the heart of Europe, it takes root in places where people had never seen such destruction. In England, the Black Death arrives quietly, with a few isolated cases being reported in the southern towns before it begins its devastating march through the rest of the kingdom. In the countryside, farmers are hit hard as their small, tight-knit communities fall prey to the same sickness that is sweeping across the cities. The plague leaves no corner of Europe untouched, and soon every town and village feels the loss. Fields lay fallow as workers die, and entire villages are abandoned as survivors flee to the hills, desperate to escape the ever-encroaching death. But the plague's most horrifying aspect is not the speed with which it spreads, or the high mortality rate, but the sheer mystery of its cause. As the bodies pile up and the bell tolls for the dead, the people of Europe turn to their faith for comfort. They pray for salvation, for answers, for mercy, but there are no answers, no reprieve. Instead, they are left to grapple with their fear and their faith, trying to make sense of the suffering around them. For the survivors, the toll of the Black Death is more than just physical. It is a profound spiritual and psychological trauma. What does it mean when such a widespread and random event occurs? What does it say about the world they thought they knew? People, struggling to comprehend the death of their families, friends, and entire communities, begin to question their faith. Why would God allow such suffering to occur? In the midst of their grief, some turn to extreme forms of devotion, engaging in public penance, whipping themselves in the streets in a desperate bid for mercy, while others, overwhelmed by the horror of it all, turn their backs on faith entirely. But the plague does not stop. It continues its march through Europe, claiming lives by the millions. In some places, as many as 2/3 of the population is wiped out. The streets of once vibrant cities like Florence, Paris, and London are filled with the dead, with bodies stacked in the corners of homes, waiting for burial. Entire generations are wiped out in what feels like an instant. Communities, once full of bustling markets and busy workshops, are now silent, their shops boarded up and their streets empty. The Black Death, though it may seem like a mere historical event, leaves an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the European people. It changes the way they view life, death, and the world around them. The aftermath is a world irrevocably altered, where the rich and the poor are equally vulnerable, and where the fear of death lingers, a quiet shadow that will haunt Europe for generations to come. As Europe begins to rebuild in the wake of the Black Death, the scars are deep. Communities are shattered, families are broken, and economies that were once thriving now lie in ruins. Yet from the ashes of this devastation, a new world begins to take shape. The loss of so many people means that the remaining workers are in high demand, and the social order begins to shift. The old feudal structures that had once governed Europe begin to crumble, and a new era begins to take form, a world where survival becomes the most precious commodity, and where those who are left to rebuild must learn to adapt to the harsh lessons taught by the plague. The Black Death, though devastating, ultimately led to significant changes in Europe. The labour shortage caused by the massive loss of life gave workers more bargaining power, leading to changes in wages and working conditions. The death of so many people also created a new social mobility that was unheard of before. In time, these changes would help shape the rise of the Renaissance, a period that would give birth to a new era of art, science, and humanism. But for those who lived through the horrors of the Black Death, the memories would never fade. The faces of the dead, the sound of the bell tolling for the lost, and the smell of the plague would linger in their minds long after the disease had passed. It would be a shadow that they would carry with them, a reminder that, in the face of death, nothing, no wealth, no power, no social standing, could offer true protection. In the heart of France, Paris stands as a city of contrast. Its towering spires, majestic cathedral, and cobbled streets, lined with busy merchants and travellers, fill the air with the buzz of life. It is a city that pulses with activity, the lifeblood of a kingdom, and the cultural hub of Europe. Paris has long been a city of great wealth and influence. Its markets full of luxuries from the East, its scholars studying the ancient texts of the Greeks and Romans, and its churches filled with the sounds of Gregorian chants and the rustle of vestments. Life here, though tough for the common folk, seems to move with a rhythm, one dictated by the seasons, the trade, and the church. The year is 1347. The sun rises and sets over Paris in much the same way it always has. The people go about their business, merchants selling spices from distant lands, craftsmen shaping stone and wood with practiced hands, and farmers bringing their goods into the city to sell. It's a place where the poor line the streets begging for alms, while the wealthy stroll past, secure in their own sense of privilege. Paris, though not free from its struggles, seems content. It is a world defined by its routines and its familiar faces. But beneath the surface of the bustling city, something far more dangerous is beginning to take shape. Paris, a city used to the regular rhythms of life, is about to be thrown into turmoil by an invisible enemy, a sickness that no one understands, and one that no one can prepare for. The city that thrives on trade and travel, that depends on its merchants and craftsmen to keep the streets alive with activity, will soon face an enemy that no wall, no army, and no wealth can stop. Paris has long been connected to the larger trade routes of Europe. The River Seine, winding through the heart of the city, serves as the lifeblood of commerce. Ships laden with goods sail in and out of the port, bringing the finest silks, spices, and goods from distant lands. But with the rise of trade also comes the spread of something far more insidious: disease. It is in the air, carried not just by traders, but by the very people who live in the city, who come from all corners of Europe. The first whispers of the plague have already spread, though they seem like little more than rumours. Some say it is a punishment from God, others speculate that it is a poison or curse. No one can agree on its origin, but no one truly believes it will reach the heart of Paris. The city is too grand, too proud, too full of life to be touched by such a thing. Surely the plague is a distant problem for far-off lands, or so they think. But then, the first signs appear, seemingly insignificant at first. A few cases of illness, mild fevers that come and go. People dismiss it as nothing more than the regular illness that comes with the changing seasons. But as the days pass, the cases grow more frequent, more severe. The symptoms are strange. Fevers that burn like fire, chills that shake the body to its core, and swollen lumps in the armpits and neck. The people of Paris, who are accustomed to the ebb and flow of sickness, begin to notice that this is different. This is not like any illness they've encountered before. At first, it is just a whisper, a small, unsettling murmur in the dark corners of the city. But as the disease spreads, it becomes undeniable. People begin to die in droves. In the marketplaces, where once there were lively haggling and laughter, there are now hushed conversations, fearful glances, and the silent shuffle of feet as people hurry to get away from the sick. The wealthy, who had never known a life without privilege, begin to retreat into their homes, fearing the reach of the disease. The poor, who have always been at the mercy of their surroundings, now have nowhere to go. They are just as vulnerable as anyone else, and no matter how quickly they run, the plague follows. But the true horror of the plague is its speed. In a matter of days, entire families are wiped out. The city's streets, once filled with the sounds of busy merchants and travellers, fall dormant. The once ornate streets of Paris, lined with the grand buildings of kings and nobility, become eerily quiet. The shops are shuttered. The bakers' ovens grow cold. The cries of the poor, the suffering of the sick, fill the empty streets. There is no way to stop it. The plague doesn't care for wealth or status. It strikes everyone, from the poorest beggar to the wealthiest noble. The church, a powerful and central force in medieval Paris, turns into a place of mourning. The bell tolls constantly, signalling another death. The priests, once respected figures of faith and authority, are now powerless in the face of such devastation. They pray, they chant, they beg for God's mercy, but the plague shows no sign of slowing. The people, desperate for answers, turn to their faith in greater numbers, hoping for salvation, but finding only silence in return. As the plague takes hold of Paris, the city begins to unravel. What was once a place of bustling commerce, art and culture now echoes with the sound of doors being bolted shut and streets abandoned in haste. The once vibrant marketplaces are eerily silent, the only sounds being the occasional creak of wooden carts and the distant toll of the church bells marking another death. Fear has become the currency in Paris now, more valuable than gold or silver. Panic is spreading faster than the disease itself, and the people of Paris are left to grapple with an enemy they cannot see, understand, or escape. At first, the wealthy and powerful try to shield themselves. They lock their doors, retreat to their grand estates, and hire servants to care for their needs from a distance. They believe that wealth and status will offer protection, that the walls of their grand homes will keep the disease at bay. But the plague doesn't care for fine homes, expensive gowns, or noble blood. It sees only the body, and it strikes with an indiscriminate ferocity. The nobility, who once prided themselves on their control over the city, are now just as vulnerable as the common folk. The streets, once full of life, are now filled with death. Bodies lie unburied in the homes of the deceased, abandoned by families who have either fled or perished. The smell of decay begins to hang in the air, mixing with the foul stench of sickness. The usual activities of the city, the bustling markets, the crowds at the Notre Dame Cathedral, the sound of artisans working, are now replaced with silence and fear. No one knows who will be the next to fall ill or when it will strike. All they know is that there is no escaping it. The first instinct of the people is to flee, but there are no safe places left. Those who try to escape by carriage, on foot or by boat, soon discover that the plague is already waiting for them in other towns and cities. The merchants who had travelled from Genoa bringing the disease to Paris now see their trade routes collapsing. The economy grinds to a halt as travellers, pilgrims and traders refuse to cross into infected areas. The city is sealed off, and the plague moves swiftly through the streets, moving from the wealthiest houses to the humblest shacks with brutal efficiency. Soon, rumours begin to spread. Some say the plague is God's punishment for humanity's sins, a divine reckoning for a world that has become too corrupt. Others whisper that it is the work of witches or dark sorcery. The people are desperate for an explanation, any explanation, and so they cling to whatever theory they can find. The clergy, already stretched thin trying to tend to the sick and dying, struggle to offer comfort. But their prayers seem hollow in the face of such overwhelming death. They continue to hold Mass, but the church pews are increasingly empty, as people fear the contagion within the sacred walls. By now, even the most devout are questioning their faith. The plague seems to mock their prayers, as if it does not listen to their cries for mercy. The poor, who have long suffered from disease and poverty, are no strangers to hardship, yet this is different. The Black Death is not a normal affliction. It is a force of nature, an invisible shadow that moves through the city, claiming the lives of anyone it touches. As the death toll rises, the people of Paris are left to wonder, what will happen to them? Will they be the next to fall? Will their children, their families, be taken away before their eyes? In the midst of this devastation, there are no easy answers. There is only uncertainty and fear. Desperation grows as the burial grounds begin to overflow. In some places, The city's graveyards are so full that bodies are dumped into mass graves hastily buried in the earth with little ceremony. It becomes too much for the priests to manage, and they are soon overwhelmed. Even the act of burying the dead becomes dangerous, as those who handle the bodies are at risk of being infected. The authorities, who have always been able to control the masses with force, now find themselves unable to manage the crisis. The people are left to fend for themselves, and survival becomes the only concern. In the dark corners of Paris, people begin to turn on each other. The fear of infection grows so great that neighbours abandon one another. Some families, fearing that they are already infected, cast out their own relatives, leaving them to die alone in the streets. There is no mercy, no compassion, only the instinct to survive at any cost. And yet, despite the chaos and the fear, a strange resilience begins to emerge. In the midst of the devastation, there are those who refuse to give in to despair. The poor, who have always known suffering, find ways to help one another. They create small communities in the streets, banding together to look after the sick and the dying. They share what little food they have left and offer whatever comfort they can to those who are lost. The nobility may have their wealth, but the poor have something more: community. And it is this bond that will help them survive the worst of the plague's wrath. The fear in Paris is palpable. Each day brings new losses, new faces taken by the disease. But even as the city crumbles, there are whispers of hope, of those who have managed to survive. How is it that some escape the plague's grasp while others succumb so quickly? Is there a way to avoid the inevitable? Is there something they have done, something they have in their homes, that protects them from the disease? The answer is elusive. Some say it's the cleanliness of the home, others believe it's the strength of their faith. But as the death toll rises and the bodies pile up, the people of Paris are left to ask, if survival is a matter of luck or fate, what chance do they have? The toll of the plague has been merciless. What was once a city of life and vibrancy is now reduced to a shell of its former self. The streets of Paris, which once echoed with the bustling sounds of merchants, craftsmen and chatter, are now eerily silent. Only the distant sound of the church bells tolling for the dead breaks the stillness. The smell of decay lingers in the air, as bodies are left unburied in the rush to tend to the sick. Once grand homes, now abandoned and decaying, stand in stark contrast to the city that once hummed with life. As Paris continues to endure the horror of the Black Death, a strange and fragile sense of survival emerges. Those who remain in the city find that life must go on, even in the face of such overwhelming loss. The plague, it seems, has taken not just the lives of loved ones, but the very heart of the city itself. And yet, amidst the rubble, there is a quiet perseverance, an attempt to rebuild what little can be salvaged from the chaos. The authorities, who had initially seemed powerless in the face of the plague, now attempt to enforce what little order remains. Quarantines are established in an effort to prevent the disease from spreading, though these measures prove to be largely ineffective. Still, the city presses on. The markets, once filled with life, are now sparse. The goods from far-off lands that once filled the stalls are now few and far between. But the people, desperate to continue living, begin to adapt. They find new ways to carry on, holding on to the smallest routines, clinging to any semblance of normalcy. In the neighbourhoods of Paris, those who survive begin to form small communities of support. The wealthy, once secluded in their grand estates, are not immune from the plague's reach. But many of them, too afraid to face the realities of their own mortality, abandon their homes and flee the city. The common people, those who have no means to escape, are left to fend for themselves. But there is a solidarity among the survivors. They help each other bury the dead, care for the sick, and share what little they have left. For the survivors, the streets of Paris now feel like a battlefield. Every step they take is fraught with the danger of the plague. The sick are carted away, their bodies disposed of with little ceremony. But even in the face of so much death, the city begins to heal. It is not a rapid recovery, but a slow and painful return to life. The survivors begin to rebuild their homes, their businesses, their lives. The people of Paris, though scarred, do not give up. They continue to labour, to create, to live. The devastation of the Black Death has forever altered the fabric of the city. The old ways of life have been shattered, and a new world begins to take shape. In the absence of so many people, the survivors must learn to adapt to the changing social structure. The labour shortage caused by the death of so many has given the common people new bargaining power. wages in GS, and the remnants of the aristocracy, though still in power, find themselves no longer as the unquestioned rulers of Paris. The social order, once so rigid, begins to loosen. The people of Paris are now empowered in ways they never were before. Though the plague is not over, and the death toll continues to rise, the survivors begin to look to the future. They have seen the depths of suffering and loss, and yet they have also seen the strength it takes to survive. The city once again becomes a place of resilience. The streets may be emptier, the markets quieter, but Paris has not been broken. It may have been scarred, but it will rebuild. The scars, though deep, are a reminder of the strength of those who remain. In the coming years, as the world slowly recovers from the ravages of the Black Death, Paris will regain its position as a hub of culture, art and learning. The Renaissance, a new era of creativity and enlightenment, will rise from the ashes of devastation. But for those who lived through the plague, the memories of the Black Death will never fade. The fear, the loss, the uncertainty, these will remain in their hearts forever. But in that darkness, they have learned something vital. The will to survive is stronger than the fear of death. The streets of Paris will never be the same. The ghosts of the plague, the thousands who perished, will always linger in the city's soul. But Paris has always been a city that endures. And though it was brought to its knees, it rises again, stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever before. The year 1347 marks a time when cities and towns across Europe are gripped by fear. The Black Death, having ravaged the east and passed through the Mediterranean, is now moving inexorably toward the heart of Europe. The plague knows no boundaries. It travels swiftly from one place to another, leaving a trail of death behind it. As the disease spreads, the authorities, overwhelmed and desperate, begin to take drastic measures to protect their towns and cities. The plague is an invisible enemy creeping through the streets, entering homes, and claiming lives with terrifying efficiency. The response from local leaders is swift and harsh: quarantines. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40, the number of days ships and travellers were required to be isolated before entering the safe confines of the city. But as the plague spreads, this period of isolation becomes a necessary, if ineffective, measure to try to stop the disease. For towns like Venice, Genoa and Milan, quarantining becomes a vital step in their effort to protect the rest of their citizens from the unstoppable force of the Black Death. However, not all the towns are ready to face the plague head-on. At first, the town gates in many areas remain open, the idea of closing them unthinkable. Life in medieval towns is deeply connected to trade, and any measure that threatens commerce is met with resistance. Merchants from distant lands bring goods, and their arrival is a vital part of the local economy. Shutting the gates to the outside world would mean halting the flow of goods, an action that might prove just as deadly to the people as the plague itself. But as the first reports of death begin to trickle in from cities along the Mediterranean coast, the mood begins to change. What was once unthinkable is now considered necessary. In the northern Italian towns, local officials begin to take precautions, closing their gates to all outside traffic, with some towns even refusing entry to anyone who has recently visited the affected areas. The reality of the situation begins to sink in. Isolation may be the only way to protect their people. Venice, one of the richest and most powerful cities in Europe at the time, faces the crisis with an air of controlled fear. The government, which once prided itself on its vast trading empire, now faces the grim reality of quarantine. In 1348, the Venetian authorities are among the first to impose strict quarantine measures. They shut down the port, and all ships arriving from infected regions are ordered to stay at anchor for 40 days. No one may leave the ships, and no one may enter the city. The Venetians, who once ruled the seas, are now facing a disease that is more dangerous than any fleet they have ever battled. In other towns across Italy and Europe, similar measures are taken. Florence closes its gates, and people who have recently travelled to affected regions are told to remain in isolation for a period of time. Milan too begins to barricade itself. The city walls, once a symbol of power and control, are now seen as a barrier between life and death. The people who live within these walls can feel safer, but those on the outside are left to face the plague alone. However, not all responses are uniform. Some towns, especially in the more rural areas, are slow to act. Fear still has a way of creeping up on people, and the idea of a deadly plague seems so distant and foreign that many refuse to believe it is coming for them. In these towns, the plague enters undetected, as people refuse to recognize the severity of the situation. Only when the bodies start to pile up does the reality become clear, but by then, it is often too late. Quarantining a town that has already been infected is like closing the barn door after the horse has bolted. One such town is Avignon, the temporary home of the papacy during the 14th century. Located in southern France, Avignon was a city full of political and religious power. But as the plague encroaches upon the town, the authorities there find themselves unprepared. The measures they implement, though well-intentioned, are not enough to stop the disease. Avignon quickly becomes overwhelmed, and it is not long before even the clergy are falling ill. The Pope, aware of the inevitability of the plague, moves to take refuge in a private palace, sealing himself off from his people. He does not trust the very measures he had put in place to keep the plague at bay. The fear that comes with the closing of the gates is palpable. People are not only afraid of the plague, but also of being left behind. There are stories of travellers being turned away at the city gates, rejected not just by the guards, but by the very people they once called neighbours. In many towns, desperation leads to betrayal. Families hide their sick and bequeatures, hoping that the guards will not notice, while others use bribes and offers of food to gain access to the otherwise sealed-off towns. As the plague tightens its grip on the European continent, the quarantines prove to be little more than a temporary solution. The disease moves faster than the authorities can control it, and towns that once thought they were safe soon find themselves overwhelmed by the relentless spread of the plague. Quarantine becomes a symbol of not only the fear of the disease, but of a broken system struggling to cope with something beyond its control. In the end, these early attempts at isolation serve as a testament to the desperation of a people trying to protect themselves from an enemy they don't understand. The gates of Paris, Milan, and Venice may close, but the plague continues to march relentlessly across Europe, taking its toll with each passing day. The idea of quarantine, though born from a desire to protect the vulnerable, ultimately proves to be insufficient in the face of such a powerful and invisible foe. As the plague spreads throughout Europe, towns that have initially imposed quarantines begin to experience the overwhelming weight of trying to keep the disease at bay. The authorities, once certain that isolation could protect them, now find themselves caught in a desperate race against time. While quarantines may slow the spread, they cannot stop the plague. The invisible enemy moves through the cracks of their defences, finding its way into homes, markets, and hearts. The quarantines, which initially seemed like a measure of safety, become a source of increasing tension. People who had been locked away in their homes, unable to go about their usual routines, grow restless. Rumours swirl about the effectiveness of the quarantines. Some towns, seeing that their neighbours are still falling victim to the plague despite the isolation, begin to question whether their efforts are worth the price they are paying. In Milan, the wealthy families who had hoped to escape the disease by retreating behind the city walls find that wealth alone cannot protect them. As the plague continues to infect the city, some of the richest families take their chances and attempt to flee the city, hoping to find refuge in the countryside. But Milan, like so many other cities, becomes a symbol of the futility of such efforts. The plague moves faster than anyone can run, and even in the open fields, those who have fled find themselves unable to escape its grasp. What once seemed like a peaceful refuge quickly becomes a place of terror as the disease claims the lives of the fleeing families just as easily as it claimed those left behind. As towns continue to struggle with maintaining control, they are forced to take even more extreme measures. In some areas, guards are placed at every entrance, and anyone caught attempting to enter or leave without permission is met with swift punishment. For the first time, towns begin to close their gates for good, leaving those inside isolated from the world. In many cases, travellers are denied entry, even if they are not sick. Suspicion becomes the currency of the day, and people grow fearful of anyone they don't recognise. In the countryside, the rural population faces its own set of challenges. While some farmers have successfully fled to their land and set up temporary shelter, many are left in a state of confusion. The rigid social structure of feudalism that had defined life for centuries has been disrupted. Some lords are left without enough workers to harvest their crops, while peasants who remain fear the coming winter and the scarcity of food that will follow. The labourers, now in higher demand due to the death of so many, are able to negotiate better wages and conditions, but in many places, this newfound power is short-lived. As the economy falters and people become more desperate, the rich begin to use their power to squeeze what they can from the remaining poor. the spread of the plague also brings out the darker side of human nature. The scarcity of food and resources makes people more suspicious and distrustful. Communities that once depended on each other now begin to fall apart. Neighbours, once close, start to turn against one another, as the possibility of infection outweighs any concern for friendship or shared history. People hide their sick relatives, afraid that if they are discovered, the guards will drag them away to their certain death. In some cases, entire families are abandoned, left to die alone in the hope of saving the rest of the household. The authorities, realizing that the quarantines are failing, begin to resort to increasingly harsh measures. In some places, entire neighborhoods are cordoned off and marked as infected zones, while those within are not allowed to leave or receive help. Guards are ordered to prevent anyone from entering these zones, and anyone who tries is met with violence. The brutality of these measures increases as the towns grow more desperate. In some places, even the dead are not treated with respect. The bodies are thrown into mass graves with little ceremony, the stench of decay overwhelming the senses. The cemeteries, once reserved for peaceful burials, become fields of death, plots for those who have been claimed too quickly to receive proper rites. The psychological toll on the population is just as devastating as the physical one. In some areas, people begin to turn to religious explanations for their suffering. The plague is seen as a punishment from God for the sins of mankind. Public penance and flagellation become common sights in the streets as groups of people march through the towns, whipping themselves in an attempt to atone for their sins and seek forgiveness. But even these acts of faith seem to do little to halt the plague's progress. The clergy, once a central force of authority and guidance, are overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the crisis. Many of the priests themselves fall ill, leaving their flocks without spiritual guidance in their time of greatest need. In other places, superstition and fear drive people to more extreme measures. Accusations of witchcraft and sorcery rise. Those who are believed to be cursed, or who have been blamed for causing the plague, are dragged from their homes and executed. Often, these scapegoats are women, widows, elderly women, or women who live on the edges of the community. The fear of death breeds irrationality, and people look for someone, anyone, to blame for the suffering that surrounds them. The helpless and the vulnerable are often the first to suffer in such times, as they become easy targets for the wrath of a frightened and angry populace. As the quarantines continue and the disease continues to spread, towns begin to face the grim reality that there is no safe place. No matter how tightly they close their gates, no matter how many guards they post, the plague finds a way in. The disease is already inside the walls, carried by those who have travelled from the infected regions, by merchants, by sailors, by the very people who had once been tasked with keeping the gates secure. In the end, the Black Death is unstoppable. No matter how hard they try, no one can keep it at bay forever. As the Black Death continues to ravage Europe, the once vibrant towns that had so diligently tried to protect themselves behind their quarantine walls now face a new and terrifying reality: the collapse of their very structures, both social and physical. Despite their best efforts, the plague has made its way into every town and every city, leaving destruction in its wake. The gates that once served as barriers against the invisible enemy now stand as grim monuments to the futility of isolation. In Milan, once a thriving centre of culture and trade, the streets are now ghostly quiet. The noble houses, which had once been bustling with activity, are now empty, as many of Milan's wealthiest families flee to the countryside, hoping to escape the plague. Those who remain behind are faced with the harsh reality of trying to survive in a city that is falling apart. The marketplace, once filled with the sounds of haggling and commerce, is now silent. The vendors gone, their wares abandoned. The city's walls, which had once symbolised security and control, are now a reminder of the walls that can't protect against such a widespread and deadly force. Yet even as the disease continues its deadly march through Milan and other cities, there is a sense of resilience that begins to emerge from the ashes of despair. The survivors, though battered and broken, refuse to give up. They are no longer just trying to escape the plague, they are now focused on rebuilding, on surviving in a world that has been irrevocably altered. The streets may be empty, but the determination to move forward is still alive, buried beneath layers of fear and grief. Across the countryside, the story is much the same. Entire villages are wiped out, their inhabitants either dead or fled. The farms, which had once provided the lifeblood of the local economy, lie fallow, as the workers who tended to them succumb to the disease. In the absence of so many workers, the land itself begins to take on a desolate, abandoned feel. Yet slowly the survivors begin to return. These are not the same people who left. They are changed, hardened by the devastation they've witnessed. They begin to work the land again, to plant crops and rebuild their homes, not knowing whether the plague will return, but choosing to face the future rather than be consumed by the past. In these rural areas, the death toll is staggering. In some villages, it is said that not a single soul remains alive. Entire communities, which had once lived side by side for generations, are now reduced to nothing more than memories. The idea of a community begins to take on new meaning. Those who survive must forge new bonds, often with strangers, to rebuild what has been lost. These new communities, formed from the ashes of devastation, will be key in the recovery process, even though the emotional scars of the plague will linger for years to come. The clergy too begin to adapt to the new reality. In the early days of the plague, many of the priests and monks had tried to offer comfort, praying for the souls of the dying, offering the sacraments and providing what spiritual guidance they could. But as the plague claimed so many of their fellow clergy, the church itself was left vulnerable. The Pope, seeing that even the sacred walls of the church could not keep the disease at bay, is forced to retreat into the safety of a more isolated environment. In the absence of priests and monks, lay people take on more responsibility for the burial of the dead, for the care of the sick, and for offering the last rites. In many ways, the people begin to rely more on their community than on the church to guide them through the darkest moments of their lives. Even as cities like Milan, Florence, and Venice slowly recover, there is a stark difference in the way society functions. The wealthy, who had once enjoyed the luxury of power and privilege, now find themselves facing the consequences of their actions. Many of them have lost loved ones, but they also realize that the plague has stripped them of some of the control they once held. In many places, the feudal system that had long governed Europe begins to weaken. Workers who survived the plague find themselves in a position of newfound power. The shortage of labour means that those who are left can demand better wages and working conditions. This shift in power begins to break down the old social structures, creating a new world that is less rigid, less predictable. The survivors, who once lived in fear, now begin to embrace a new kind of resilience. The plague, though devastating, has changed them in ways that they are only beginning to understand. For some, the plague has brought about a sense of spiritual awakening. They see it as a test of their faith, trial they must endure in order to prove their devotion. For others, the plague has shaken their belief in divine protection, leaving them to rely on themselves and their communities for survival. The memories of the dead linger in the minds of those who survive. The empty streets, the abandoned houses, the mass graves, they all serve as reminders of the fragility of life. But these survivors are not broken. They have learned that survival is about more than just avoiding death. It is about finding meaning in the midst of chaos, about rebuilding when everything has been lost. Over the coming years, the remnants of the old world will gradually give way to a new one. The Renaissance, that great period of rebirth, will emerge from the ashes of the plague. Artists, scientists, and thinkers will rise, inspired by the idea that life must be lived to the fullest, and that death, while inevitable, should not define them. The legacy of the Black Death, though filled with unimaginable sorrow, will also pave the way for a new age of human exploration and discovery. Venice, the jewel of the Adriatic, is a city unlike any other in medieval Europe. Built on a vast network of canals, it is a city of water, where gondolas glide silently through the winding streets, and towering buildings reflect in the murky water below. Venice has long been a powerful and wealthy city-state, a hub for trade between the East and West. Its merchants, who have made their fortunes through the city's strategic location on the trade routes, bring goods from all corners of the known world, spices from India, silks from China, and jewels from Africa. Venice is rich, influential, and, to many, untouchable. But in the spring of 1348, the city begins to feel the first whispers of a storm unlike any it has ever faced. The Black Death, that invisible enemy that has already ravaged cities along the Mediterranean coast, is now making its way toward Venice. The first signs are subtle. Unusual reports from neighbouring towns, strange rumours whispered in the streets, and mysterious deaths occurring in the distant corners of the city. At first, there is little panic. Venice, after all, has always been a city of control, a city of order. It is a place where trade flourishes because everything works as it should. People follow the rules, the city runs smoothly, and the canals flow like lifeblood through the heart of the Republic. But the rumours of the plague begin to spread faster than the city can contain them. It is said to have come from the east, brought on ships that docked in the city's harbour. The ships, laden with goods and cargo from the Mediterranean, carry with them more than just trade, they carry disease. The sailors, though not yet showing signs of illness, are the first to bring the sickness into the city. The plague, carried by fleas on rats, enters Venice unnoticed, creeping into the cracks of the city, moving like an invisible current beneath the surface. At first, the city's elite are sceptical. Venice is rich, after all, and its wealth has always shielded it from many of the dangers that have plagued other cities. The ruling class, the Doge and his advisors, are slow to react, unsure of how to respond to a threat they do not understand. The people of Venice, like many others, believe that the plague is a distant problem, something that affects only the poor, the outcasts, or the far-flung cities of the East. Surely a city as powerful as Venice can avoid the worst of it. But within weeks, the first victims begin to fall. The signs are unmistakable: fevers that burn with intensity, followed by painful swelling in the groin, armpits, and neck. The skin turns black, the telltale marks of the plague. The city's doctors, though trained in the rudimentary medicine of the time, have no answers. They are powerless against a disease they cannot understand, and their attempts to treat the sick seem only to hasten their death. The first few deaths are seen as isolated incidents, but soon the toll begins to climb. The canals that once teemed with activity now float with the bodies of those who have succumbed to the plague. The Venetian authorities, realizing that this is no ordinary illness, begin to panic. The city's very existence is now in jeopardy. In the face of such widespread devastation, the Venetians turn to what they know best: control. They impose a quarantine on ships arriving in the harbour, hoping to contain the disease before it spreads throughout the city. Ships are kept out at sea for 40 days, a measure designed to ensure that no one with the plague can set foot on Venetian soil. But the plague, as it will soon be known, does not respect such measures. It is an invisible force slipping through cracks, finding ways into homes and markets, into the very streets where the Venetians live and work. As the disease spreads, fear grips the city. The once bustling marketplaces are abandoned, as merchants refuse to bring goods into the city for fear of infection. Those who can afford to leave the city do so, fleeing to their country estates, or taking refuge on the islands that dot the Venetian lagoon. But for the poor, who have no means of escape, there is no refuge. They are left to fend for themselves in a city that is slowly being overtaken by death. In Venice, as in other cities, the wealthy are often the first to escape the plague. Their estates are secluded, their homes are well guarded, and they believe that they can outrun the disease. But in truth, no one is safe. The plague moves too quickly, and no matter how far you run, it will catch up to you. Even the wealthy, with all their resources, cannot escape its reach. One by one, the prominent families of Venice are struck down by the disease, their houses left empty, their palaces silent. The plague is indiscriminate. It does not care for wealth, power, or influence. It takes from everyone. The streets of Venice, once filled with the sound of gondolas, the chatter of merchants, and the laughter of the people, now grow quiet. The canals, which have always been a symbol of life and movement in the city, are now lined with the bodies of the dead. There is no time for proper burials. The dead are hastily tossed into mass graves, their names forgotten. The authorities try to manage the chaos, but they are overwhelmed. The disease spreads faster than they can contain it, and soon it is clear that Venice will not escape this plague unscathed. But even as the death toll rises, the resilience of the people of Venice begins to shine through. The survivors, though terrified, band together to help one another. They tend to the sick, care for the dying, and begin to bury the dead in what little time they have. The wealthy, though they retreat to their estates, send food and resources to the city, hoping to help those who remain. The church, though weakened by the loss of so many priests and clergy, continues to offer what comfort it can, holding mass for the dead and offering prayers for the souls of those who have passed. But even the church, with all its power, cannot stave off the unstoppable tide of death. Venice, a city founded on the very principle of commerce, finds itself at a critical turning point as the plague ravages its population. The very canals that once flowed with the lifeblood of trade are now silent, save for the occasional ripple of water as bodies float by, abandoned by those too afraid to deal with the dead. The Venetian Republic, which once prided itself on its power, wealth, and political influence, now faces a crisis unlike any it has ever seen. The Black Death has no respect for the systems of governance, the barriers of social class, or the strength of military might. The disease spreads, uncaring of the city's political structure, and the people of Venice are left to fight for survival in an unprecedented crisis. In the early days, the government of Venice tries to enforce measures to limit the damage. The city's great arsenal, which had long been a symbol of Venice's military might, is put to use in an effort to quarantine the population. The authorities enforce a strict system of isolation, preventing people from moving freely throughout the city. But the disease moves too fast. By the time Venice's authorities have sealed the gates and established checkpoints, the plague is already well within the city's walls. There are reports of entire neighbourhoods falling silent as families are decimated. Shops are boarded up, and the once vibrant streets of Venice now seem like a city on the verge of collapse. In the grand palaces and halls of the Doge's palace, where the city's ruling elite had once governed with a sense of authority and certainty, the leaders of Venice are now paralysed by fear. The Doge, the elected ruler of the city who once sat at the head of a powerful and respected government, is now unable to offer any real leadership. The plague's grip on the city is tightening, and the once proud political machine of Venice falters. As the death toll rises, so too does the panic. The merchants who had brought wealth and prosperity to the city are dying. The labourers who had worked the docks, keeping the Venetian ships afloat, are falling sick. Even the noble families who had once considered themselves untouchable are not spared. The rich and powerful are losing loved ones, their estates now sitting vacant as they flee to the countryside. As Venice becomes consumed by the plague, the political structure of the city begins to crumble. The Doge and his councillors, overwhelmed by the catastrophe, find it difficult to govern. The city's well-organised bureaucracy is no longer able to function as it once did. With so many dead and so many others in hiding, Venice's political and social systems fall apart. What was once a republic based on power, trade and strict order, now seems like a distant memory. The citizens of Venice, many of whom were already struggling with poverty and disease before the plague arrived, are left to fend for themselves. The once praised unity of Venice has dissolved, replaced by fear and isolation. But as the city's government collapses under the weight of the plague, a strange thing happens. The survivors, those who are left behind, begin to take matters into their own hands. Small, tightly knit communities form in the midst of the destruction. Neighbours help one another, sharing what little food they have, offering shelter to those who are left without homes. The noble families, though still holding on to their wealth, have lost the power they once wielded. The common people, who have always been at the mercy of the elites, now find themselves with the power to shape the city's future. But they are not blind to the cost of this shift. They have lost too much to the plague to embrace it fully. Their survival has come at a terrible cost. The religious leaders of Venice, too, find themselves lost in the face of such an all-encompassing disaster. The church had long been a pillar of stability in the lives of the Venetian people. Yet, as the plague claims the lives of many of its clergy, the church's power begins to wane. Priests, once respected and powerful figures, are now seen as ineffective in the face of such devastation. Their prayers, once thought to be capable of warding off evil, now seem hollow in the face of the disease's indiscriminate death toll. The people of Venice, though still loyal to their faith, begin to turn inward, relying more on each other and less on the promises of divine protection. Amidst the suffering, Venice's economy is crumbling. The city's vast merchant network, once thriving, is now a shadow of its former self. Trade routes are disrupted, and ships are no longer able to dock safely in the harbour. The city's famous glass industry, which had once been a symbol of Venetian craftsmanship, is all but halted. The wealthy families who once filled the city's coffers now find themselves struggling to maintain their status. But it is the lower classes that suffer the most. Without trade, without work, and without the support of the government, the poor are left to face the plague alone. In the absence of government and clergy, there are whispers of rebellion. Though the plague has taken so much from the city already, the people begin to see an opportunity. For the first time they feel a glimmer of power. They begin to realise that their survival, though still uncertain, is no longer solely dependent on the whims of the wealthy or the Doge. The very foundations of Venetian society, so carefully crafted over centuries, are now crumbling. It is an uncertain time, a time of great loss, but it is also a time of great potential for change. The survivors of Venice, though broken and scattered, begin to forge a new path. They are marked by the plague, scarred by its toll, but they are also resilient. The once proud city of canals, which had ruled the seas and thrived on its wealth, is now a city of survival. The Black Death, though it may have destroyed Venice, has also given rise to a new kind of power, a power that will emerge from the rubble of the old. As Venice grapples with the aftermath of the plague, the city that once ruled the Mediterranean finds itself irrevocably changed. The streets, once filled with the vibrant bustle of trade, are now nearly empty. The once thriving marketplaces, where merchants from distant lands haggled over spices, silk, and rare treasures, stand silent. The grandeur of Venice's palaces, which had gleamed in the sunlight, now sit darkened, as many of the city's nobility have either fled or fallen victim to the plague. The canals, so symbolic of the city's life and wealth, now float only with the remnants of the dead, their peaceful ripples disturbed by the chaos that surrounds them. Yet amid this devastation, a strange resilience begins to emerge. The survivors, those few who have managed to outlast the plague, begin to rebuild their lives from the wreckage of a city that was once the heart of commerce and culture. Though the city is far from the prosperous hub it once was, there is an undeniable sense of defiance in the air. Life, though fragile, continues. In the broken streets, the survivors begin to piece together what is left of their homes, their families, and their businesses. The plague, though it has taken much, has also left behind something else: opportunity. The survivors, many of whom are labourers and common folk, now find themselves in positions of power that they could have never dreamed of before. With so many of the rich and powerful either dead or gone, the old social hierarchies begin to collapse. Those who were once mere servants or shopkeepers now find themselves in a position to take control, to rebuild Venice in a new image. The balance of power in the city is no longer determined solely by wealth, but by those who remain, those who have shown the resilience to survive. In the absence of their noble families, the people of Venice begin to form new alliances. Small communities of survivors band together, supporting each other through the difficult months ahead. There is no longer a single dominant voice that speaks for Venice. Instead, a loose coalition of surviving leaders, many of them from the lower classes, begins to take shape. They rebuild homes, re-establish trade with other cities, and begin to restore order to the chaos that has enveloped their lives. But the path to recovery is not easy. The death toll from the plague has been staggering, and many of the city's key industries, including glassmaking, shipbuilding, and textile production, are crippled. The once bustling port is quiet, as few ships dare to dock at a city so recently ravaged by disease. Venice's dominance as a trading hub is no longer certain. Without the merchants, sailors, and workers who once kept the city thriving, the future of Venice seems uncertain at best. Yet from the ashes of this catastrophe, a new vision for Venice begins to emerge. The people, who have long been used to hardship, begin to adapt to their new circumstances. They turn to the few remaining resources they have: the canals, their traditional craftsmanship, and their reputation for survival. As the city rebuilds, it is not just the physical structures that are restored, but the spirit of Venice itself. The city that had once been brought to its knees by the plague now begins to find new purpose. The Venetians, who once saw themselves as rulers of the seas, now turn inward. Their newfound survival is no longer about domination. It is about rebuilding, about finding a new way of life. They begin to embrace the arts once more, seeking to revive the culture and intellectual pursuits that had long defined the city. The survivors, though scarred by the plague, begin to look to the future, not just to survive, but to thrive once again. Venice, though weakened, becomes a city of innovation and creativity. As the survivors return to their work, they bring new ideas, new technologies, and new perspectives to the table. The Venetian glassmakers, for instance, begin to experiment with new designs and techniques, creating works of art that will eventually become famous throughout Europe. The artisans, who had once worked in obscurity, are now sought after for their unique skills and craftsmanship. The survivors realize that in the face of destruction, there is a chance for reinvention. In time, the city's economy begins to stabilize. Though it will never fully return to the heights it once knew, Venice begins to regain its strength, driven not by its old power, but by the resilience and creativity of its people. The canals, once symbolic of Venice's wealth and trade, are now seen as symbols of endurance. The city may have been broken by the plague, but it is not defeated. The Venetians have learned a valuable lesson, that survival, though difficult, is a triumph in itself. As Venice rises from the ashes, it becomes a symbol of the resilience of human spirit. The Black Death, though it has claimed the lives of countless individuals, has also paved the way for a new Venice, one that is less about power and wealth and more about survival and reinvention. In the centuries to come, Venice will become famous once again for its art, its architecture, and its ability to endure. The plague, while leaving scars that will never fully fade, also marks the beginning of a new chapter for the city, a city that will, in time, find its place at the heart of the Renaissance. The great stone walls of medieval castles, once symbols of power and invulnerability, are now no match for the creeping death that threatens to tear apart the foundations of European society. These formidable structures, built to withstand sieges and invaders, have long stood as fortresses for the nobility, the wealthy and powerful families who held dominion over vast lands, peasants and resources. But in 1347, as the Black Death makes its way across Europe, these castles, with all their wealth and security, are revealed to be just as fragile as any village or city. The noble families, accustomed to commanding armies and collecting taxes, are now faced with an enemy they cannot fight off with swords or shields. The plague, arriving like a shadow in the night, slips silently through the stone walls of castles, taking the lives of lords, ladies, and their household staff with brutal efficiency. No wealth, no fortification, no amount of land can save them. In the castles of northern France and England, the initial reaction is one of disbelief. The plague, which has already ravaged the cities and towns, is still seen as a distant problem by many of the noble families. After all, they have the best physicians, the best protections, and the finest food. Surely these things would keep them safe. But as the first cases of illness appear among the household staff and in the village surrounding the castle, the nobles are forced to reckon with the reality that they too are not immune to this invisible killer. The first to fall are the lower-ranking servants, the maids, stable hands, and footmen who work tirelessly to keep the great houses of the nobility running. They are the first to contract the disease, as they are the ones who travel in and out of the castle, interacting with the outside world. The noble families, shielded from the poor by their stone walls, are blissfully unaware of how quickly the plague is spreading until it begins to take root in their own halls. At first, the nobles try to dismiss the reports of illness as isolated incidents. They seal off their homes, hoping that by staying inside their castles and shutting out the outside world, they can avoid the plague. But it is not long before even the most isolated estates are touched. The disease spreads silently, carried by rats and fleas, finding its way into the very bedchambers of the nobility. By the time the first lord of the manor succumbs to the illness, it is too late. The noble families realize that no castle, no matter how fortified, can protect them from the plague. The nobles, once used to commanding armies and giving orders from their grand thrones, now find themselves powerless. Their physicians, who have long been the go-to experts in medicine, are as helpless as anyone else. They can offer little in the way of treatment, relying on antiquated remedies like herbal infusions and bloodletting, practices that are ultimately ineffective against the plague. The lords and ladies of the castles, once the elite of society, are now just as vulnerable as the peasants they once ruled over. As the disease spreads through the castle's halls, the power dynamics shift. The once pampered nobles begin to fall ill, one by one. The ladies of the house, who had once overseen the household with grace and poise, are now bedridden, suffering from fever and chills. The lords, who had once commanded their vassals with a look, are reduced to trembling, feverish wrecks, unable to even stand. The elegant banquets, once a sign of their wealth and status, are replaced by quiet, mournful dinners in the dimly lit halls, where even the most powerful feel the weight of fear and helplessness. In some castles, entire families are wiped out. In the absence of heirs, estates are left in disarray, with no one to take up the mantle of leadership. The peasants who had once lived under the rule of these nobles are now left to fend for themselves, without guidance or protection. Some may leave for the cities, hoping to escape the plague, while others remain behind, uncertain of what the future holds. For the noble families that survive, the experience of the plague is a humbling one. The once untouchable world of castles and opulence is now stained with death. The sense of invulnerability, which had long been associated with noble bloodlines, is shattered. The rulers of the land, once feared and respected, now realize that their power is fragile, vulnerable to forces beyond their control. They are reminded that their lives, too, are bound by the same fragile thread that connects all of humanity to death. In the aftermath of the plague, the nobility begins to change. Some castles, still occupied by surviving family members, become smaller and more isolated as the remaining lords and ladies struggle to rebuild their shattered lives. In some cases, the once great families of the nobility are reduced to penury, unable to recover the wealth and power they once held. The survivors, many of whom are young heirs who have lost their parents and siblings, must now find a way to navigate a world that has been irrevocably altered. The political and social order that had once allowed the nobility to flourish is no longer the same, but the experience also leads to a shift in perception. The lords and ladies who survived the plague return to their roles with a new understanding of the fragility of life. They no longer rule with the same arrogance and detachment from the world below. They see their people, the peasants and workers who had once served them, in a new light. The feudal system, which had once defined the relationship between nobility and serfs, begins to loosen. The survivors, scarred by the plague and humbled by its reach, begin to rethink their roles in society. In the years that follow, the nobility of Europe, forever marked by the Black Death, will begin to change. The old system of feudalism, which had kept the rich and poor in rigid classes, will slowly give way to new social dynamics. While the nobles may still control vast estates, their power will no longer be as absolute as it once was. The plague has taken much from them, but it has also shown them that their control over life and death is, at best, an illusion. The plague that swept through the castles of Europe did more than decimate noble families. It shattered the illusions of power and control that had been long associated with the aristocracy. Castles, once considered impregnable fortresses, became tombs of both the dead and the living. Lords and ladies who once dined on the finest foods, clothed in expensive silks, and gave orders from their grand estates, were now lying side by side with their servants, sick and dying. The grim irony was that the nobility, who had lived lives of privilege and security, had no defence against the plague, an invisible force that neither gold nor status could repel. As the bodies of the aristocracy piled up within their great stone homes, the survivors were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. In many cases, entire noble families were wiped out, leaving their lands, estates and titles to distant relatives, or sometimes to no one at all. With the death of the heads of these families, the structure of society itself began to unravel. In some castles, the surviving heirs, often young and inexperienced, were thrust into positions of power that they were ill-prepared for. But the true loss wasn't just of life, it was the loss of the very framework that had held together medieval society for centuries. The noble families had long been the backbone of political and social order, but as the Black Death erased so many of them from existence, the political landscape changed forever. The loss was not only physical, it was deeply psychological. The aristocracy had been so accustomed to living in a world where their status set them apart, where their wealth and land granted them both privilege and protection. But the plague had taught them a bitter lesson. No matter how high you rise, death is inevitable. It is a reminder of the impermanence of power and wealth. For those who survived, the reckoning was swift. Once rigid social hierarchies began to soften, and those who had once served the nobility began to find their place in a new order. One of the key aspects of this new reality was the shifting relationship between the nobility and their peasantry. The very people who had once been at the mercy of the aristocrats now saw their status begin to rise. With so many deaths among the upper classes, labour became scarce, and surviving workers were in a much stronger bargaining position. Some peasants, emboldened by their newfound value, demanded better wages and living conditions. Where once the feudal system had held them firmly in their place, they now found that they could negotiate and even own land in some instances. While the full effects of these shifts would not be fully felt until later, the seeds were sown during the aftermath of the plague. In the castles where the remaining nobles struggled to rebuild, many found themselves with fewer resources, less power and less influence. They were now surrounded by reminders of the lives that had been lost, empty chambers, abandoned halls, and vast estates that were now too large for their dwindling numbers. Some noble families, faced with the immense cost of maintaining such estates, were forced to sell off portions of their lands, while others saw their fortunes dwindle as they tried to retain their titles and properties. The wariness of this era brought a sense of paranoia. Every cough, every fever, became a signal that perhaps the plague had returned. The fear of death had consumed not just the castle's inhabitants, but also their ability to govern and lead effectively. Yet amidst this uncertainty, a new vision of nobility began to emerge. The surviving nobles who managed to pull through the plague were forever marked by the loss. No longer were they the untouchable rulers of vast lands. They were now humanized by their experiences. The plague had torn away their illusion of invulnerability, and in its place many of them began to view their roles with new humility. The nobility's reckoning was also shaped by the shifting political landscape. The social unrest caused by the plague sparked an undercurrent of reform. New leaders, some of whom were once minor figures, began to rise to power. These leaders, while not always from noble families, capitalized on the instability caused by the plague and the vacuum left by the death of so many aristocrats. The growing influence of the merchant class, who had not been as devastated by the plague, began to challenge the established order. The cities, once beholden to the nobility, began to wield more power. It wasn't long before the idea of the noble class began to take on a different role, one that was more tied to land and less about political control. For the castles that survived, life did not return to normal quickly. Where once extravagant banquets were held in the grand halls, there were now sombre gatherings. Many castles, now sparsely populated, became almost like mausoleums to their former inhabitants. Some nobles, filled with grief over the loss of family members and the devastation of their estates, turned inward. They retreated into their private spaces, rarely leaving their homes, overwhelmed by the enormity of their grief. Others, however, began to see the plague as a time of opportunity. Though they were broken by the weight of the past, these survivors began to adapt, finding new ways to navigate the world that had been altered so drastically. In the midst of all this, the grand traditions of nobility that had once defined life in the castles began to give way to more practical concerns. Castles, which had once served as symbols of power and control, were now seen as places of survival. The vast estates were not just places for feasts and lavish celebrations, but became the last refuge for those who had endured the worst. The focus turned to preservation of life, land, and legacy. The nobility, though forever changed, would find a way to rebuild, but it would no longer be the same. As the dust settled and the survivors began to rebuild their lives, the idea of nobility itself began to evolve. The plague had not just killed individuals, it had reshaped the very nature of power and class. In the years to come, the remnants of feudalism would be challenged by rising new ideas of governance, trade, and society. The scars of the Black Death would remain, but so would the lessons learned by those who survived. In the aftermath of the plague, the world of medieval nobility, once defined by its wealth, power, and intricate social hierarchies, finds itself unrecognizable. Castles that had been the heart of aristocratic life now stand as silent monuments to a forgotten age, their grandeur muted by the weight of the lives lost within their walls. The streets that once bustled with the sound of horses' hooves and the chatter of servants now echo with a haunting silence. The nobility, having weathered the storm of the Black Death, are left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives and, in many cases, their broken estates. But what happens after devastation? How do societies rebuild when the foundations that once supported them are eroded by loss, fear, and grief? For the surviving aristocracy, the path forward is not one of simple restoration. Instead, it is a journey of adaptation, of re-evaluation, and of profound change. The system of feudalism that had once been so firmly entrenched in the fabric of medieval society begins to unravel. The very roles that the nobles once held, lords, ladies, landowners, are now in flux. With so many dead, the surviving noble families find that the world they knew has been irreversibly altered. The once dominant noble class is forced to confront a new reality. Their power is no longer as absolute as it once was. The Black Death, while devastating, has had an unexpected consequence. It has shifted the balance of power between the ruling class and the common folk. The very feudal system that had kept peasants in subjugation begins to loosen. Those who survived the plague are now in a position to bargain for better wages, improved living conditions, and more freedoms. The landless peasants who once worked tirelessly for their lords now realise that they are in high demand. Without enough workers to tend to the fields and care for the animals, the once immovable structure of the nobility begins to crack. This newfound power of the common folk does not go unnoticed by the surviving nobility. While some may try to cling to the old ways, others begin to understand that the world has shifted beneath their feet. The once unassailable position of the lord and lady is now more vulnerable than it ever was. This realization leads to a period of reckoning, where those who have inherited the titles and lands of their families must find a way to navigate a changed world. Some surviving noble families, particularly those whose wealth has been decimated by the plague, begin to change their approach to governance. The traditional feudal model of landholding and vassalage, once so ingrained in the nobility's identity, begins to be challenged. In the absence of so many noble heirs, those who survive are left with no choice but to reimagine their role in society. Some turn to commerce and trade, using the wealth they still have to establish new avenues of power. Others begin to embrace the idea of consolidation, merging estates and lands to strengthen their position. Perhaps the most profound shift comes in the way the nobility relates to their land and the people who work it. The days of the lord as the absolute ruler, free to exact taxes and labour from his tenants without question, are fading. Instead, some nobles begin to treat their surviving tenants with more respect, recognising the value of human capital in rebuilding their estates. The once distant relationship between lord and peasant begins to transform into a more cooperative arrangement. It is still not an equal partnership, but there is an undeniable change in the air. The nobility, humbled by the plague, begin to see their roles as stewards of the land and protectors of their people, not just as exploiters of labour. This shift is not universal. There are still lords who refuse to adapt, who cling to the old ways and attempt to rule with the same authoritarian style that had defined their families for centuries. These nobles may find themselves isolated, as their peasants grow restless and demand better treatment. Rebellions, though small and scattered, begin to stir in certain regions where the common folk, emboldened by their newfound power, rise against their former overlords. These uprisings are often short-lived, but they serve as a stark reminder that the old order is no longer invincible. Meanwhile, the surviving members of the nobility who embrace change find that their families' legacies are not simply defined by land and titles. They begin to invest in the arts, in education, and in the intellectual and cultural movements that will lay the foundation for the Renaissance. The loss of so much life and wealth forces them to reevaluate their priorities. They no longer view their titles as the be-all and end-all of their identity. They begin to see their role in the larger world, not just as rulers of land, but as patrons of culture, art, and thought. The plague, though tragic, has created a space for rebirth, for new ideas, and for a re-evaluation of the role that nobility plays in society. As the nobility emerges from the darkness of the Black Death, it is clear that the future of medieval Europe will be different. The rigid, hierarchical social structure that had existed for centuries will never be the same. The surviving lords and ladies, scarred by the plague but determined to rebuild, will leave behind a world that is less feudal and more fluid. The common folk, empowered by their survival and their new bargaining power, will help shape a new social order, one that will lay the groundwork for the political and social revolutions of the future. The great castles that once symbolised the power of the nobility will not disappear, but they will no longer be the centres of absolute control they once were. They will become places of reflection, of history, and of transformation. The lords and ladies who once ruled from these fortresses will no longer be the untouchable figures they once were. Instead, they will become part of a larger, more interconnected world, a world where power is shared, not hoarded, and where survival is no longer dependent on the wealth of the land, but on the resilience of the people. And so, from the ashes of the plague, a new order is born. The nobility, forever marked by their experiences with death and loss, will never be the same. They will be forced to adapt, to change, and to find new ways to wield their influence. The castles they once ruled from will stand as reminders of a world that was, and a world that must now be rebuilt. And through it all, the people, those who survived the plague, will rise, their power no longer determined solely by birth or title, but by their ability to endure, to adapt, and to rebuild a world that has been irrevocably altered by death. The Black Death, sweeping across Europe in the mid-14th century, is an invisible predator striking with terrifying swiftness. Infected rats and fleas, unwittingly carried by traders and travellers, spread the disease from city to city, village to village, leaving a path of destruction in their wake. For many of the people of medieval Europe, the plague was a harbinger of death, and survival itself became the greatest challenge. The rich and powerful retreated into their estates, hoping that their wealth and status could offer them protection. The poor, with fewer resources and little means to escape, were left to face the oncoming storm with nothing but fear and uncertainty. But there were those who chose a different path. The outcasts, the wanderers, the ones who did not belong to the tightly knit social orders of medieval life. The plague, in its indiscriminate nature, left many behind, those without families, those without lands, and those who lived on the fringes of society. They had no wealth, no powerful connections, no castles to retreat to. They were the beggars, the criminals, the labourers, the ones whose lives were already defined by hardship long before the plague came. Yet when the storm of the Black Death descended upon the cities, it was they who found themselves with a strange advantage. They had nothing to lose. In the early stages of the plague's arrival, the wealthy and the powerful tried to shield themselves from the disease. They built higher walls, hired more guards, and locked themselves away from the world outside. They clung to their wealth, believing it could shield them from the suffering that gripped the rest of Europe. But their attempts to escape were futile. As the disease spread, the cities were overtaken, and soon even the wealthiest families were falling victim to the plague. The aristocrats who had always viewed the lower classes as expendable were now fighting the same invisible enemy. Their power and influence no protection against the inevitable. Meanwhile, those on the edges of society, the beggars, the outcasts, and the criminals, found that their lives had already prepared them for a different kind of survival. They did not have the luxury of high walls or estates to flee to. Instead, they lived on the move, in constant motion, their lives a series of short-lived shelters and stolen moments. These outcasts, in many ways, were more adaptable to the chaos brought on by the plague than those who had always lived in safety and comfort. In the face of the overwhelming death toll in the cities, many of the poor who had long struggled to survive in the urban environments began to look for ways to escape the plague. Some fled to the countryside, hoping to find a refuge away from the densely populated areas where the disease spread most rapidly. They gathered what little they had, and with whatever strength they could muster, they set off toward rural towns, villages and farms, hoping to escape the fate that seemed inevitable in the cities. But even in the countryside, they found no refuge. The plague did not discriminate between the cities and the villages. It struck wherever people gathered. For many of these outcasts, the experience of fleeing was not a one-time event. They were used to living on the margins of society, often without stable homes or consistent work. Their lives were a constant journey from one place to another, from one city to the next. And when the plague came, they simply did what they had always done, move on. But as they travelled, they encountered hostility from those who feared the disease, and many were turned away at the gates of towns and villages. The poor, once accepted as part of the social fabric, were now seen as carriers of disease, and the wealthy began to build even higher walls, both literal and figurative, to keep them out. The growing fear of the plague led to an atmosphere of suspicion. Townspeople who had once welcomed travellers and strangers now looked at them with fear. The outcasts who had wandered the roads were now seen as potential threats. Fearing that these travellers might bring the plague into their homes, the residents of many villages began to shut their gates and deny entry to anyone they did not know. This growing distrust created a deeper divide between the poor and the wealthy, as the once marginalised found themselves even more isolated. As more people died, society began to break down. The streets of cities were deserted, except for the dead and the desperate. The once bustling marketplaces, where goods were exchanged for coin, were now empty. The markets became silent places of loss, as people no longer had the energy or resources to trade. In this void, the outcasts found a strange sense of freedom. Without the strictures of society to confine them, they were free to move through the empty streets, free to seek out what little remained. But even this freedom came at a cost. As they ventured further from the cities, they found that they were no longer able to rely on the same networks of support that they had once taken for granted. The collapse of social order meant that even the most basic survival mechanisms were now out of reach. The idea of escape for the outcasts was a way of life. They had always been accustomed to travelling light, to living off the land, to relying on the kindness or indifference of strangers. But now the kindness was gone. Those who had once given food or shelter to the poor and homeless now turned away in fear, not knowing who might be carrying the plague. The wandering beggars and thieves, once able to survive by exploiting the goodwill of others, now found themselves at the mercy of the very people they had once depended on. Yet despite the widespread fear and isolation, there were moments of kindness. Some villagers, moved by compassion or necessity, opened their doors to the fleeing outcasts, offering them shelter and food. Others, recognizing the shared humanity of those in need, found ways to help. In the midst of the plague's destruction, a new sense of solidarity began to emerge. one that was born not from wealth or status but from shared survival. The outcasts, in their struggle to survive, found strength in numbers. They shared their food, their resources and their stories, helping one another as they navigated a world that had become unrecognizable. As the Black Death continues to spread across Europe, the outcasts who fled the cities in search of safety find themselves caught between two worlds. The countryside, once a refuge from the chaos of the plague-ridden cities, becomes a place of suspicion and fear. The villagers, though perhaps less affected by the disease initially, begin to close their gates to anyone they do not recognize. The once welcoming rural areas, with their peaceful farmlands and quiet villages, now seem as hostile and uncertain as the cities they left behind. In some places, the outcasts find no solace. As more people try to flee the cities, the roads grow crowded with desperate souls, beggars, thieves, peasants, and travellers, all running from an invisible enemy. The journey is treacherous, not only because of the plague, but because of the growing hostility from those they encounter along the way. The outcasts, many of whom are already malnourished and sick, find themselves pushed further to the margins. Their very survival becomes a matter of endurance, enduring the fear, the isolation, and the unrelenting movement from one place to the next. Some villages, though still harbouring some compassion, become overwhelmed by the sheer number of refugees. The survivors of the plague, now accustomed to hardship and fear, are willing to do anything to survive. They beg for food, seek shelter in barns, and travel through the night to avoid being turned away. They move in small groups, hoping that their numbers might protect them from the suspicions of those who would rather shut their doors than risk infection. But as the plague creeps ever closer to the countryside, the once small villages that had once seemed like havens of peace are no longer safe. With the arrival of more travellers, more outcasts, the fear of contagion becomes overwhelming. Even the poorest of villages, where survival was once a collective effort, begin to fracture under the pressure. Old alliances break down, and the fabric of rural life begins to fray. The villagers, many of whom had never known a life outside their small communities, turn inward. They circle the wagons, so to speak, refusing to allow anyone from the outside to enter. These small isolated communities that once stood for mutual aid and support are now transformed into closed-off fortresses, with only the most trusted insiders allowed to pass through their gates. In these dark times, survival becomes a solitary pursuit. The outcasts, once part of a larger, if neglected society, are now alone. They move through the countryside in search of food, water, and shelter, finding only cold, indifferent faces along the way. Yet even in this brutal new world, there are those who are willing to offer help. The kindness of strangers, though rare, remains a glimmer of hope for the outcasts. Some, particularly the elderly or those too ill to continue, find themselves taken in by the most compassionate of villagers who offer them what little they can. Others, more fortunate, find a safe haven among fellow outcasts, creating small communities of survival within the chaos. But for every act of compassion, there are many more of fear and rejection. The outcasts are met with suspicion wherever they go. The fear of contagion is so pervasive that it overpowers the natural inclination toward hospitality. Towns that once welcomed travellers now bar their gates, forcing the outcasts to wander, searching for an empty space where they can rest. The open roads become their only refuge, but even that offers little comfort. The land itself seems to conspire against them. The crops they once relied on are withering in the fields. The animals they once hunted have been driven away by fear and scarcity. The outcasts, now alone in the wilderness, struggle to find food and water while the disease creeps ever closer. Yet despite the growing hardship, there is a sense of resilience that begins to take root among the outcasts. They adapt, learning how to survive by their wits and the strength of their bonds with one another. In the absence of established systems and protections, they turn inward, relying on the collective strength of their small groups to keep moving. Some begin to trade goods and services, bartering what little they have left in order to stay alive. Others simply focus on the basics, finding food, finding shelter, and staying one step ahead of the plague. The outcasts, though seemingly powerless in the face of the larger forces at play, begin to reclaim their agency in small ways. They are no longer the invisible members of society, they are now survivors in their own right. The plague has stripped away the structures of wealth, power, and hierarchy that once defined the world. The outcasts, once the lowest in the social order, are now equal to those who once ruled over them. They have no castles to retreat to, no wealth to protect them, But they have something far more valuable, the will to survive. This struggle to survive, however, comes with its own set of consequences. For many of the outcasts, the constant movement, the lack of food and shelter, and the ever-present fear of death begin to take their toll. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and sickness begin to claim their own. The roads, once a symbol of freedom and escape, become a silent graveyard for those who can no longer keep up with the march of survival. The outcasts who once roamed the world in search of opportunity now find themselves in a grim reality, where the only thing they can rely on is the kindness of strangers, and the hope that they will continue to survive another day. After months of wandering the desolate roads and facing the harsh realities of the plague-stricken countryside, the outcasts find themselves at a critical juncture. The fear, isolation, and struggle for survival have shaped them into a new breed of survivor. They no longer belong to the social orders that once defined their existence, whether they were beggars, thieves, or labourers. The Black Death has blurred the lines of society, forcing these marginalised individuals to face a new world where survival is the only currency, and old social constructs have lost their meaning. In the isolated corners of Europe, the outcasts, once feared and ignored, begin to form new communities. These communities are born from necessity, as these survivors pool their meagre resources to help each other through the worst of the plague's aftermath. These small groups form tight-knit societies, where the bonds of survival and shared hardship forge new kinds of alliances. The strangers who once roamed the countryside, isolated and alone, now begin to work together in ways they never would have considered before. Though these new communities are often born of desperation, they offer a strange kind of hope. People who had once been cast aside now begin to find strength in one another. They share stories of what they've lost and what they've endured. These groups are not without their own problems. Tensions run high as resources remain scarce, and distrust still lingers in the air. But through all this, they begin to rebuild, not just for themselves, but for the next generation, who might one day inherit a world that has been irrevocably changed. In some parts of the countryside, groups of survivors start to cultivate small patches of land. These outcasts, once unable to own anything or contribute meaningfully to society, now take ownership of their own survival. They farm what little land they can find, plant what little crops are left, and raise what few animals still remain. Though their lives are far from easy, the very act of cultivating the land, of shaping it to their will, offers them a sense of purpose, a sense of dignity that had long been stripped away by the brutal realities of the plague. One of the most profound changes for these outcasts is the way they begin to relate to the land and to the people around them. The years of living on the edge of society have given them an intimate knowledge of survival, of what is needed to endure when all else seems lost. Their experiences, though filled with suffering, have taught them a unique resilience. No longer dependent on the structures of the old world, they find themselves in charge of their own fate. They begin to understand that survival is not just about outliving the plague, it is about reclaiming their lives, rebuilding from the bottom up, and rediscovering the power that lies in self-reliance. As the survivors slowly rebuild their lives, they find that the world they knew is gone. The old systems of wealth and status no longer have the same power they once did. The surviving peasants, labourers and outcasts are no longer bound by the same feudal obligations that once kept them in check. In many places, the old lords and nobles, whose power had once been absolute, are now in decline. The collapse of the feudal system, driven in part by the death of so many nobles and the rise of a new, more egalitarian society, paves the way for a shift in the social order. These outcasts, who had once been at the mercy of the powerful, now find themselves at the forefront of a new world. While many of the old landowners, having lost much of their wealth and influence, retreat to their estates to lick their wounds, the survivors in the countryside begin to find their voices. They demand fair wages, more respect, and better living conditions. The labour market, decimated by the plague, is now in their hands. They no longer fear the old authority, for they have seen the weakness of the system they once served. In a world where death has levelled the playing field, the survivors are no longer bound by the old social contracts that had kept them in servitude. And it is not just the survivors who are changing. The cities too begin to see a transformation. As the plague ebbs, the people who had once fled for the countryside begin to return. The merchants, the workers, and even some of the displaced nobility begin to rebuild the urban centres. But this time things are different. The survivors are no longer willing to accept the same inequalities that existed before the plague. The outcasts, now reintegrated into society, refuse to be subjugated again. They bring with them a new sense of empowerment, having endured the worst and lived to see the dawn of a new age. Their voices, once silenced, are now heard in the streets and marketplaces. The Black Death has stripped away the old world, and in its place a new one is emerging. For the first time in generations, the people who had once been at the bottom of the social ladder are beginning to demand equality. The survivors, having borne witness to the fragility of life and the collapse of the old structures, begin to forge a new kind of society, one where survival is not just about wealth or status, but about the collective strength of the community. The cities are no longer the exclusive domain of the powerful. They are now places where anyone with the will to work, to survive and to contribute can find a place. The outcasts once on the fringes of society have now become the backbone of a new world. They are the survivors, the builders, the ones who have seen the worst and still stand tall. Their journey, which began in fear and desperation, now takes on a new meaning. A journey of empowerment, of reclaiming their lives, and of shaping a new society from the ruins of the old. The plague, though it had taken so much, had also given birth to something unexpected. A new sense of unity, strength, and resilience among the survivors. The outcasts, who had once been forced to live in the shadows, now find themselves in the light. And as they rebuild, they find that they are not just rebuilding their homes or their lands, they are rebuilding themselves. In the wake of the Black Death, one of the most significant yet often overlooked consequences of the plague was its devastating impact on agriculture and farming communities across Europe. The great fields, once filled with crops and the toil of harvest, fell silent as death swept through the ranks of labourers, farmers and landowners. Fields were left untended, farms abandoned, and the natural rhythm of rural life was shattered. The Black Death did not just decimate the population, it upended the very systems of production that had sustained Europe's agrarian economy for centuries. The plague, which swept through the towns and cities of Europe in waves, spread quickly to the countryside. At first, the rural populations, so far removed from the dense populations of the cities, felt relatively safe. But soon, the disease reached even the most isolated villages, carried by travellers, merchants, and even the very rats that scurried through the fields. In many places, entire villages were wiped out. Those who had worked the land for generations now lay dead in their homes, and with them the knowledge of farming that had been passed down through the centuries. In these early days, many farmers were left with the daunting task of not only surviving the plague, but also maintaining the crops they had so carefully cultivated. As the disease took hold, those who were able to continue working in the fields were often few and far between. The result was that harvests were left uncollected, and crops rotted in the fields. The failure to bring in the harvest meant that food scarcity became an immediate threat. Without enough hands to work the land and with death hanging over their heads, many farmers were forced to abandon their lands altogether, joining the wave of peasants fleeing to the cities or the countryside to escape the plague. For those who remained behind, the challenge was not just to farm but to stay alive. The few surviving farmers were overwhelmed by the sheer amount of work needed to tend the land. They could no longer rely on the labour of the many who had once worked by their side. The plague had taken both the skilled labourers and the unskilled, and now even the surviving farmers faced the prospect of working the land alone. Without enough hands, the vital crops that were essential for survival could not be tended properly. In the towns and cities, the rich, having fled to their estates or isolated palaces, were often shielded from the direct consequences of the plague. However, the effects on agriculture rippled through the economy. With fewer crops being harvested, there was less food to sell and less income to be made. In many regions, the wealthy found that even their vast estates, once prosperous, were now at risk. With the labourers dead or missing, the rich found themselves unable to manage their lands effectively. Without their peasants to tend to the fields, they faced significant financial losses. The farms were not only unable to produce enough food to feed the population, but also lacked the means to produce the surpluses that had once made the nobility's wealth. The market for agricultural goods, once thriving, began to collapse. Grain prices soared, and what little food remained became a commodity for the wealthy. The peasants who remained on the land, few as they were often forced into a state of dependence on the wealthier landowners, who had the resources to sustain them through the worst of the crisis. However, this created a new form of inequality. Those who were lucky enough to remain employed were often subject to more exploitative conditions, working harder and longer hours for less pay, in exchange for the small amount of food and protection offered by the landowners. But the difficulties faced by farmers in the wake of the plague were not just economic. they were also social. In many places, so once the disease took hold, it created deep rifts between the survivors and the dead. Families and entire communities were left shattered. The emotional toll was profound, as many farmers had lost not just their families but also their livelihoods. The plague did not just kill, it tore apart the social fabric of rural communities. With the disappearance of entire families, the elderly who had once passed on knowledge of farming techniques were gone, leaving the younger generation struggling to adapt. As the years passed and the survivors began to rebuild, the impact of the Black Death on farming began to reshape rural life. With fewer hands to work the land, many farmers turned to new methods to increase productivity. They experimented with crop rotation and new types of farming tools, realizing that the old methods of farming were no longer enough to support the populations that remained. They sought ways to make the most of what little they had, developing more efficient agricultural practices. However, the effects of the plague were long-lasting. The impact on agriculture was not limited to a single year or harvest season. The long-term consequences of the Black Death on farming communities were felt for generations. Fields that had once been abundant with crops became barren. Farmers who had lost everything struggled to rebuild their families and their lands. The loss of so much life left a scar on the landscape that would not easily heal. The rural world, though slowly rebuilding, would never be the same again. Yet in the midst of this hardship, some farmers began to find ways to persevere. They learned to rely on their ingenuity and resourcefulness to adapt to a new world where survival was uncertain. These survivors, though scarred by the loss of their loved ones, found strength in the land itself. They worked tirelessly to revive their farms, planting new crops, repairing old tools, and seeking new ways to ensure that food would again flourish in the fields. The work was hard, but in the end, it was their resilience, their refusal to give in to despair, that would ensure that farming, though forever altered by the plague, would continue to sustain life. As the survivors of the Black Death emerge from the shadow of the pandemic, the rural world, once firmly rooted in centuries-old agricultural practices, begins to change in ways that could never have been imagined before. The death toll, having claimed not only the workers of the land but also their families and communities, has left entire swaths of farmland untended. Farmers, struggling with both the physical and emotional toll of the plague, find themselves grappling with an entirely new reality, one in which they must learn to adapt not only to the loss of life, but to the rapidly shifting landscape of the medieval economy. At first, the survivors of the farming communities must simply try to survive. The shock of the death toll is immense, and the grief that follows is just as overwhelming. Whole families, parents, children, grandparents, have perished, leaving behind empty fields and unharvested crops. Farmers must quickly learn to take up the tasks that were once shared among many. Tasks that were once divided between different members of a family or a community. Planting, weeding, harvesting now fall to one or two survivors. These labourers are often exhausted, not only from the physical toll of managing an entire farm, but also from the emotional weight of watching everything they once knew fall apart. Still they work, driven by the hope of reviving the land and preserving what little they can for future generations. In many regions, the vast estates once controlled by the nobility lie in ruins. Without enough peasants to work the land, the noble families who had owned the lands are faced with the immense challenge of managing their properties. For the most part, the feudal system begins to weaken. The survivors of the plague, once bound by their feudal obligations to work the land for their lords, find themselves in a unique position. Many landowners, desperate to retain what little wealth they have left, are forced to offer better terms to their labourers. While the wages may be low, the landless peasants find that they have a bit more bargaining power than before. In some cases they demand more resources, better living conditions, and even more say in how the land is worked. The power dynamics of rural life begin to shift as the balance between the landowners and the labourers changes. Farmers who had previously worked small plots of land, either as freeholders or tenants, now find themselves in the difficult position of deciding whether to leave the land entirely or stay and rebuild. The choice is not an easy one. Those who remain in the countryside often face the daunting challenge of rebuilding what has been lost. But they also begin to realise the importance of what they have left, the land itself. For many, the idea of leaving is simply not an option. The land, though damaged, is still where their lives are rooted. Even in the face of loss and devastation, it is all they have, yet staying on the land is not without its challenges. With fewer people to work the land, farming becomes harder and more fragmented. Fields that were once shared by multiple families now lie fallow or are divided into smaller plots that can barely support one family. Farmers must learn to work the land more efficiently, making the most out of what little they have. This is the beginning of the slow, painful shift toward new agricultural techniques. The old ways of farming, which have been passed down for generations, are no longer enough. Farmers must now experiment with new methods, crop rotation, better irrigation techniques, and more efficient tools to make the most of the limited resources they have. One of the most important changes in this period of recovery is the slow emergence of a more individualistic approach to farming. In the absence of the community-based labour force that had once been essential to medieval agriculture, farmers begin to rely more heavily on their own knowledge and skills. While some are able to adapt quickly, others struggle. The land is unforgiving and the work is grueling, yet through sheer perseverance many farmers begin to rebuild. They may not have the luxury of a large workforce, but they find creative solutions to the problems they face. In the wake of the plague, the surviving farmers begin to carve out a new kind of life, one where individual ingenuity becomes a cornerstone of survival. At the same time, the rural population finds that the traditional methods of social support, extended families, village gatherings and community labour, are no longer as effective as they once were. The labour force that had once supported the farms has been reduced, and the familial structures that had helped guide agricultural practices are often gone. With the loss of so many family members, the surviving farmers find themselves with fewer people to rely on. The tight-knit rural communities that once shared labour, meals and knowledge are now scattered and weakened. The farmers who remain must forge new relationships, often with strangers, in order to rebuild. These new alliances are not always easy to form, but they are essential for survival. As the years pass and the worst of the plague begins to fade from memory, some farmers find that they can begin to rebuild their communities. Though the bonds between them may not be as strong as they once were, there is a growing sense of solidarity among the survivors. Slowly, the empty fields that once seemed so daunting begin to fill again with crops. The work is hard and the progress slow, but there is hope. For the first time in years, farmers begin to think not just of surviving but of thriving. They plant crops with care, raise animals with skill, and build their lives from the land that they have fought so hard to preserve. Years have passed since the Black Death ravaged Europe, and though much has been lost, much has also been rebuilt. The survivors of the plague, particularly the farmers who endured the harshest consequences, have adapted to a world that has changed beyond recognition. The rural landscape, though still scarred by the years of death and abandonment, begins to show signs of life once again. The outlying fields, which were left fallow or overgrown with weeds, are slowly being brought back to life. The land, once a symbol of destruction, is now seen as a means of survival, of renewal. The survivors, having weathered the worst, are now focused not only on surviving, but on making sure that their children and grandchildren inherit a better world than the one they knew. They understand that the road to recovery will be long and uncertain, but they are driven by a deep sense of purpose, to restore what was lost and to reclaim their place in a world that was almost lost to the plague. It is this sense of resilience that drives the farmers to turn the devastation they faced into a new kind of opportunity. As they work to revive their farms, the lessons learned from the hardship of the plague begin to reshape agricultural practices. The old ways of farming are no longer enough to sustain the communities, and farmers begin to experiment with new techniques. They embrace crop rotation to preserve soil fertility, new methods of irrigation to make the most of available water, and more advanced tools that make planting and harvesting easier. These changes do not come overnight. They are the result of years of trial and error, of learning from past mistakes, and of collaborating with neighbours who have endured the same hardships. Through this shared experience, the farmers slowly begin to regain the confidence they had lost. In the early years after the plague, the focus was on basic survival. Many farmers planted whatever they could, hoping to yield enough to feed themselves and their families. But as the years went on, they began to focus on improving the quality of their crops. The fields that were once dominated by barley, wheat and rye begin to grow more diverse crops. Farmers plant fruits, vegetables and legumes, experimenting with crops that were once considered luxuries. They also begin to raise livestock in more sustainable ways, increasing their stock while carefully managing the land they have left. With these changes comes a slow but steady recovery of rural communities. Small villages, where many farmers had once lived isolated lives, begin to form new networks of cooperation. Farmers share knowledge of new techniques, exchange tools, and offer advice on how to deal with pests and diseases. The sense of isolation that had characterized life before the plague begins to fade, and a sense of communal responsibility takes its place. The farmers, once fighting alone against the odds, now find strength in their unity. They understand that the future of their farms and their families depends on cooperation, not competition. The recovery of the fields also means a slow but steady recovery of the rural economy. The markets, once empty and abandoned, begin to fill with goods again. Though the market system is not what it once was, the farmers are able to sell their surplus crops and livestock to those who remain in the cities. As the population slowly starts to rebound, so too does the demand for agricultural products. It is a fragile recovery, but it is a recovery nonetheless. The prices of food and agricultural products, once inflated due to scarcity, begin to stabilize. Though there is still much work to be done, the farmers begin to see that their efforts are paying off. In the decades following the plague, Europe's agricultural landscape is irrevocably altered. The great estates of the nobility, once run by vast numbers of peasants, now rely on fewer workers, and those workers are often more independent. The feudal system, which had once kept the peasants bound to the land, is weakening, and the relationship between landlords and tenants begins to change. With fewer workers available, the power dynamics of land ownership shift. Some landowners, recognizing the value of a hard-working labour force, begin to offer more favourable terms to their tenants. Others, however, struggle to adjust to the new world and find that they cannot maintain their estates as they once did. For the farmers who survived the plague, the changing world presents new opportunities. With more land and fewer hands to work it, some farmers begin to acquire property of their own. This shift marks the beginning of a new era in rural Europe, where the traditional structures of feudalism begin to give way to a more flexible, market-driven economy. In many cases, the survivors of the Black Death use their newly acquired wealth to invest in their farms, purchasing better tools, seeds, and livestock. They begin to build better homes, create small workshops, and lay the groundwork for a more modern agricultural economy. For the children of these survivors, the world they inherit is one of possibility. Though the scars of the plague remain, they are overshadowed by the promise of a brighter future. The new agricultural techniques that were developed in the wake of the disaster become the foundation of a more prosperous and stable rural economy. The legacy of the Black Death, though tragic, is not one of total loss. It is a story of resilience, of survival, and of the quiet revolution that changed the face of agriculture in Europe. And so the farmers who lived through the plague not only survived, they built a new world from the ashes. The land, which had once been a symbol of suffering and despair, became a symbol of renewal. The Black Death, which had ravaged the continent, ultimately gave rise to a new age of agricultural innovation and economic restructuring. The outcasts, the survivors, and the humble farmers who had once been overlooked became the architects of Europe's recovery, proving that even in the face of death, the will to live and rebuild can transform the world. As the Black Death spreads like wildfire across Europe, the medical community finds itself helpless in the face of a disease unlike any it has encountered before. The plague, a deadly combination of fever, sores and delirium, appears suddenly and spreads rapidly, with entire cities falling victim within a matter of days. In the 14th century, medical knowledge is rudimentary at best. The physicians of the time rely on a mix of ancient texts, superstitions, and untested remedies to treat the sick. Yet in the face of a plague that seems to have no explanation, they are powerless. For centuries, medicine had been based on ancient Greek and Roman texts, most notably the works of Galen and Hippocrates. These teachings, though respected, were far from complete in their understanding of the human body. Physicians of the time operated with little knowledge of bacteria or viruses, and their methods of diagnosis were based on rudimentary observation rather than scientific reasoning. The most common treatments were bloodletting, herbal remedies, and prayers to saints, all of which were largely ineffective against the mysterious and deadly plague that now ravaged the population. In the early days of the Black Death, doctors were initially overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the crisis. Entire households were struck down by the disease, and the death toll rose rapidly. As the number of patients surged, physicians were unable to keep up. They lacked proper medical tools and had little knowledge of what caused the disease. Many believed the plague was a divine punishment, sent by God as a form of retribution for the sins of mankind. Some even believed that the disease was caused by bad air or miasma, a theory that, though wrong, would remain influential in medical thought for centuries. With no understanding of how the plague spread or how to treat it, doctors were largely ineffective in preventing its spread or alleviating the suffering of their patients. At the time, the concept of quarantine was in its infancy. Cities like Venice began to establish quarantine measures, requiring ships arriving from plague-ridden ports to be isolated for a period of time before their passengers were allowed ashore. However, these measures were rudimentary at best, and the disease often spread before they could be properly implemented. In an effort to protect themselves from the disease, physicians began to develop distinctive protective gear. One of the most enduring symbols of the plague in the public imagination is the iconic plague doctor mask. These masks, which would become a hallmark of plague medicine, were created by Italian physicians in the mid-14th century as a form of protection against the disease. The design of the plague doctor mask was both practical and symbolic. The masks were made of long, beak-like snouts that were filled with aromatic herbs, spices, and perfumes, believed to purify the air and protect the wearer from the bad air, or miasma thought to be responsible for the plague. The beak-like shape was not just a medical innovation, it was also a visual symbol of the physician's role in confronting death and disease. The masks were often worn with long coats made of waxed fabric, gloves, and boots, all designed to protect the physician from coming into contact with the infected. The beak itself, a curious feature of the plague doctor's attire, served several purposes. The long beak allowed the doctor to breathe through a filtered space, in theory protecting them from the miasma that was believed to carry the disease. The masks were also meant to shield the physician's face from the sight of their dying patients, reminding both doctor and patient of the grim reality of the disease. The physician would often wear gloves and a cane, both for protection and for dramatic effect. The cane allowed them to examine patients without getting too close, further reducing the risk of contamination. While the plague doctor mask became a recognizable symbol of the medical profession during the plague, it was by no means an effective solution to the crisis. The herbs placed in the beak were believed to purify the air, but they did little to protect the doctor from the true cause of the plague. The doctors who wore these masks were still largely ignorant of the true nature of the disease. Without understanding how the plague spread or how to properly treat it, they were forced to rely on outdated practices and superstition. Despite the growing use of protective gear, physicians remained largely ineffective in stopping the spread of the disease. Their treatments, ranging from bloodletting to the application of herbal poultices, did nothing to stop the progression of the plague. In fact, the death toll continued to rise across Europe, decimating populations and leaving towns and cities in ruins. It was clear that the medical profession, despite its centuries of development, was woefully unprepared for the onslaught of the Black Death. In the midst of this chaos, new approaches to medicine began to emerge. The failure of traditional treatments and remedies led to a growing interest in more scientific methods of observation and diagnosis. As physicians began to recognize the limitations of their understanding, they began to turn to more practical, though still rudimentary measures. Quarantine measures were refined, and cities began to enact more stringent rules for controlling the spread of the disease. At the same time, medical professionals began to document the progress of the disease, noting its symptoms and the progression of infection. While this early documentation did not immediately lead to an understanding of germs or viruses, it would lay the groundwork for future advancements in medical science. The Black Death, with all its horror and devastation, forced the medical community to reconsider its assumptions about disease and health. Though the answers were not immediately apparent, the crisis sparked a shift in the way medicine was practiced, pushing it toward a more empirical and observational approach. The plague doctor mask, though symbolic of a period of great ignorance, also marks the beginning of a long journey toward understanding and combating infectious diseases. As the Black Death tore through Europe, a revolution in medical thinking began to take shape, though it would take centuries before the full implications of the disease were understood. For much of the 14th century, physicians were still largely influenced by ancient Greek and Roman texts, which had been passed down for generations. The teachings of Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna were considered the bedrock of medical knowledge, but the plague's catastrophic impact on Europe shattered the belief that traditional medicine was enough to combat disease, forcing a shift in how people viewed health, disease, and the role of medical practitioners. While the plague doctors, with their distinctive beaked masks and long robes, were a visible symbol of the medical profession's attempt to combat the disease, they were not effective in understanding the actual cause or transmission of the illness. Many doctors, in their desperation to protect themselves and others, turned to various theories, none of which provided a true understanding of the plague's origins. The predominant theory at the time was miasma, the idea that disease was caused by bad air or foul smells. Physicians believed that breathing in the infected air could cause people to fall ill, so they relied on aromatic herbs and incense to purify the air, hoping to stave off disease. The beak of the plague doctor mask was designed specifically to hold these herbs, such as lavender, rosemary and other fragrant plants that were thought to protect against the pestilence. The mask was supposed to filter the air, which, in theory, would protect the doctor from inhaling contaminated air that could carry the plague. However, this method was not based on any real scientific understanding of germs or bacteria. In reality, the plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which is carried by fleas that infest rats, and it spread quickly through human contact, not through foul air. Despite this, the beaked mask became an iconic symbol of the plague, representing both the ignorance and the evolving approach to medical care during a time of crisis. Physicians were, by and large, powerless against the Black Death. Their efforts to treat the sick were futile, and many doctors themselves succumbed to the disease. The devastation led to a crisis of confidence in medical professionals. Yet in the face of overwhelming suffering, some doctors began to question the effectiveness of traditional methods and sought out new ways to understand and combat disease. During the plague, a small number of physicians began to advocate for more empirical approaches to medicine. One such physician, Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague in Florence, began to note that the disease seemed to spread through contact, through proximity to the sick. He was one of the first to recognize that the plague spread through human-to-human contact, rather than through bad air or miasma alone. While his observations were not fully understood at the time, they marked the beginnings of a new understanding of infectious disease. He was not alone. Other physicians in different parts of Europe were also beginning to question the old theories and develop a more systematic approach to studying disease, laying the groundwork for future medical advancements. In the years that followed the plague, new ideas about disease and medicine began to emerge. The lack of effective treatments during the Black Death highlighted the need for more rigorous study of the human body and disease transmission. Although the scientific revolution would not truly take hold until the 16th and 17th centuries, the devastation of the plague spurred early medical thinkers to pursue new avenues of inquiry. Medical universities in places like Italy and France began to grow, attracting scholars who were eager to study anatomy and develop a more scientific approach to medicine. By the late 15th century, autopsies began to be performed more regularly, and the study of human anatomy slowly advanced. This growing interest in dissection and observation helped lay the foundation for the advancements in biology and medicine that would follow. The plague also pushed for the development of public health measures that were previously unheard of. Quarantine practices, though primitive, began to take hold in the major cities affected by the plague. Ships arriving from plague-ridden ports were isolated for up to 40 days, hence the term quarantine, derived from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40. This was one of the first instances of a formal public health policy, and although it was not entirely successful in stopping the spread of the plague, it was an early attempt to control infectious disease outbreaks. It was a sign that the concept of disease control was slowly becoming integrated into the way society thought about public health. Another major shift in medical practice was the development of the role of the barber surgeon. With a shortage of formally trained physicians, many people turned to barbers, who were often skilled in minor surgical procedures, as their primary healthcare providers. These barber surgeons performed bloodletting, amputations, and other simple procedures that were once the domain of trained physicians. As the plague raged on, the demand for such services grew, and barber surgeons became an essential part of the medical response to the epidemic. This shift in medical practice, though born out of necessity, played a crucial role in the evolution of medical professions. Over time, the practice of surgery would be formalized, leading to the eventual establishment of surgery as a distinct medical discipline. However, despite these emerging changes in medical thought and practice, much of Europe remained stuck in its old ways. The established medical community was slow to adopt these new ideas, and many of the most influential doctors of the time still clung to outdated theories and ineffective treatments. The transition from medieval to early modern medicine was gradual, with many setbacks along the way. It would take centuries before the true causes of diseases like the plague were understood, and even longer for medical practices to evolve into the forms we recognise today. The Black Death left its indelible mark on Europe, not just in terms of population loss and economic upheaval, but also in the way it influenced the development of medical practice. While the plague itself was an undeniable disaster, it led to a slow but profound transformation in the world of medicine. The physicians who were once seen as the authorities in healthcare, despite their impotence in the face of the plague, eventually became the catalysts for future innovations that would change medicine forever. The most enduring image of the plague doctor is, of course, the distinctive mask. These masks, with their long bird-like beaks stuffed with aromatic herbs, became synonymous with medieval medicine, symbolising both the futile and hopeful efforts of physicians attempting to combat a disease they could barely understand. But in many ways, the very creation of such masks was indicative of how the medical community struggled to grasp the real nature of the disease and disease transmission. The idea behind the plague doctor's mask, while misguided, was one of the earliest examples of an attempt to control the spread of an infectious disease. The mask itself became a symbol of the battle between science, superstition, and practical experience. While it did not prevent the spread of the plague, it marked a shift towards a more protective, if not yet scientifically informed, approach to disease. The act of attempting to isolate oneself from the bad air and purifying the air with strong-smelling herbs hinted at the growing recognition that something invisible and not fully understood was spreading death. The legacy of these early efforts can be seen in the long evolution of public health measures, which would later be more scientifically grounded. The mask, though an artifact of medieval ignorance, is an emblem of humanity's desire to protect itself from the unknown. It became the precursor to more modern forms of disease control. Concepts of isolation, quarantine, and the notion of contagion as a significant health risk would eventually evolve, laying the groundwork for the germ theory of disease developed in the 19th century by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. This was the moment when science truly began to catch up with the struggles of those who lived through the plague. The medical profession too experienced transformation. Though plague doctors themselves were unable to stop the spread of the disease, their role in society began to take on more significance in the aftermath of the pandemic. The Black Death's death toll, which wiped out entire towns, left a void in the medical community. Physicians, in their effort to combat the plague, had been forced to rely on newly adopted measures: quarantine, the regulation of trade, and isolation of the sick. These concepts laid the groundwork for the more formalised medical practices that would emerge during the Renaissance and beyond. While many medieval physicians believed that the plague was a form of divine retribution, their attempts at treatment, despite being primitive and often ineffective, spurred a deep-seated desire to understand disease and illness in a more systematic way. As Europe began to recover from the initial devastation of the Black Death, new schools of medicine began to emerge. The emphasis began to shift from supernatural explanations of illness to more rational, naturalistic ones. Universities and medical colleges that had once been slow to respond to the crisis began to foster more rigorous approaches to the study of the human body and disease. Anatomical dissection, once avoided due to religious and cultural restrictions, became an important part of medical education. Physicians began to study the human body with greater attention to detail, learning more about how diseases spread, how organs functioned, and how the human body could be treated. In addition to the development of more scientific medical practices, the role of public health continued to evolve. As cities began to grow and urbanization took hold, the need for organized public health systems became more apparent. The Black Death had shown that disease could spread rapidly in crowded, unsanitary conditions. The notion of sanitation, keeping streets clean, maintaining a public water supply, and creating better systems for waste disposal, was a direct response to the lessons learned during the plague. These public health systems were rudimentary at first, but they laid the foundation for modern public health infrastructure. One of the most important legacies of the Black Death was the understanding of how communities needed to be prepared for future outbreaks. The plague had shown the world how fragile human societies could be in the face of disease. It was no longer enough to rely on individual efforts; collective action was required. This realization led to the gradual development of organized quarantine systems, the regulation of infectious disease outbreaks, and the establishment of health officials dedicated to overseeing public health. The plague doctors, with their masks and protective gear, may not have understood the true nature of the disease they were fighting, but their efforts laid the foundation for future generations of medical practitioners. They marked a pivotal moment in the history of medicine, one that would eventually lead to breakthroughs in the understanding of germs, pathogens, and the development of vaccines. In the centuries after the plague, the medical profession would continue to evolve. The discovery of microorganisms, the development of antibiotics, and the establishment of vaccines would all stand as a testament to the lessons learned from the medieval struggles against disease. But it is in the legacy of those early doctors, the ones who tried to battle the plague with little more than masks, herbs, and hope, that we see the beginning of the scientific approach to medicine. The plague doctor masks, once seen as futile and ineffective, became a symbol of resilience and the unyielding human desire to fight against the unknown. They were the first step toward a new age of medicine, an age where the understanding of disease, health, and the body would eventually save millions of lives. What began as a desperate attempt to ward off the Black Death became a foundation for the modern practices we rely on today. The Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history, not only decimated the population of Europe, but also shook the very foundation of religious belief and practice. For centuries, the Christian Church had been a pillar of stability, offering solace in times of hardship, sickness, and death. Yet when the plague arrived, sweeping through towns and cities, it posed a direct challenge to the religious teachings and beliefs that had guided medieval society for generations. In a world where faith was intertwined with every aspect of life, the sudden and indiscriminate nature of the Black Death made many question the very existence of a benevolent and protective God. The Church had long taught that suffering and disease were tests of faith, and that through prayer, penance, and devotion one could find favour in the eyes of God. But as the plague ravaged entire communities, leaving the faithful and the sinful alike stricken with death, it became increasingly difficult to reconcile this view with the brutal reality unfolding before them. As the disease spread from port to port, town to town, and city to city, churchgoers flooded the streets, looking for answers, but the clergy too were not immune. Priests, monks, and bishops succumbed to the disease just as easily as anyone else. Entire congregations found themselves bereft of religious guidance as their spiritual leaders were wiped out. In some places, the death toll among the clergy was so high that the church had no choice but to appoint new priests, many of whom were barely trained or experienced enough to fulfill their roles. With so many religious leaders lost, some parishes were left without priests for weeks, even months. As the death toll climbed, many people turned to the church for answers. They sought comfort, assurance, and explanations for why such an inexplicable catastrophe had befallen the world. However, the church's response was not immediate or universally comforting. Many religious leaders were caught up in their own fear and panic, unable to provide the guidance their congregation so desperately needed. The church, for all its power and influence, seemed as helpless as the rest of society. This sense of helplessness led to a crisis of faith for many. In a world that had relied on the church to explain the mysteries of life and death, the Black Death undermined that certainty. Why had God allowed such a devastating plague to occur? Was it a divine punishment for sin, or was it simply an inexplicable tragedy? For many, the failure of the church to protect them or offer a clear explanation eroded their trust in religious authority. As a result, the very concept of salvation began to come under scrutiny. The medieval belief that the church held the keys to heaven, and that only through the church could one be saved, was suddenly challenged by the grim reality of the plague. Those who had lived virtuous lives were struck down, while sinners survived. The idea that good deeds, religious observance, and penitence could guarantee divine favour was called into question. The clergy, many of whom had fled the cities or isolated themselves from the sick, seemed to have no answers for the people. Some even began to turn away from the church altogether, seeking other ways to find meaning and comfort in the face of such overwhelming death. Flagellant processions, which involved self-flagellation as a form of penance, spread through the cities as a way for people to take control of their fate and earn divine mercy through their suffering. These processions were often chaotic and disturbing, with people publicly whipping themselves, parading through the streets, and chanting in a desperate bid to appease God's wrath. While the church did not fully endorse these acts of extreme penance, They were an indication of the growing disillusionment with religious institutions. People were searching for answers, even if it meant turning to practices that seemed to diverge from established doctrine. Meanwhile, some church leaders attempted to maintain order and offer traditional explanations for the plague. The idea that the Black Death was a punishment for sin was commonly preached, and people were encouraged to repent for their wrongdoings in hopes of securing God's forgiveness. But for many, these explanations were insufficient. They could not understand why the faithful were being swept away in such large numbers, while the sinful lived on. The idea of divine retribution, though comforting to some, became less and less believable as the plague continued to claim the lives of good and bad alike. The plague also brought about a more pragmatic shift within the church. As the clergy grappled with the high death toll among their ranks, the church began to take a more structured approach to dealing with future outbreaks. Quarantine measures, though primitive by modern standards, were implemented to prevent the spread of disease. Some churches began to limit the number of people who could enter at any given time, and others suspended religious services altogether. The idea of public health began to take root, though it was still far removed from the sophisticated systems of disease control that would emerge centuries later. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, the church's authority was forever changed. The failure of the religious system to protect its followers during the Black Death led many to question the traditional power structures that had defined medieval Europe. This crisis of faith would lead to the rise of new religious movements, some of which would challenge the authority of the church and contribute to the eventual Protestant Reformation. The inability of the church to provide answers to the suffering and death caused by the plague created a vacuum in which new ideas could take root. The Black Death, in many ways, marked the beginning of a long period of transformation for the Christian Church. It forced religious leaders to confront their own limitations, while also exposing the flaws in the medieval understanding of the world. The crisis of faith that followed the plague would lead to a re-evaluation of the Church's role in society and set the stage for the religious upheavals that would shape the future of Europe. As the Black Death continued its grim march across Europe, leaving death in its wake, the Catholic Church found itself facing a crisis of unprecedented scale. In the centuries prior, the Church had been an unwavering pillar of life for both rich and poor, a spiritual and social force that governed nearly every aspect of life. Now, with the plague ravaging the population and church leaders dying alongside their flock, the Church's power seemed to falter in the face of this merciless epidemic. The immediate response from the religious authorities was one of prayer, penance, and attempts to explain the plague through religious doctrine. Church leaders called for mass prayers and processions, pleading for divine intervention. The faithful were encouraged to repent for their sins, as it was commonly believed that the plague was a form of divine punishment for the moral decay of society. Yet, as the death toll climbed, many began to see the Church's response as insufficient and, in some cases, hypocritical. Priests and bishops who had long preached about the importance of living righteous lives were suddenly nowhere to be found when the plague struck. Many religious leaders fled their parishes, leaving their congregations to fend for themselves. For some, this act of abandonment was seen as a betrayal, and the Church's credibility was severely damaged. The same clergy who had held power and influence over the lives of their followers for centuries now seemed just as vulnerable to death as anyone else. It became difficult for many to reconcile the idea of a protective, benevolent God with the horror they saw around them. This absence of leadership forced the laity to seek other forms of spiritual expression. New religious movements began to emerge in response to the Church's failure to provide answers or comfort. One of the most notable movements was the rise of the flagellants, groups of individuals who took extreme measures to atone for what they saw as society's collective sin. The flagellants believed that by publicly whipping themselves and enduring physical suffering, they could purge the sin that had brought about the plague. These processions, which involved large groups of people marching through the streets while flagellating themselves, were both a display of religious fervour and a desperate plea for mercy. The flagellant movement spread across Europe, often with violent and fanatical undertones. Though initially the Church tolerated the movement, it eventually began to crack down on the flagellants as their actions became more radical. The Church was concerned that the flagellants were bypassing the authority of the clergy by taking matters of salvation into their own hands. Despite the Church's condemnation, the movement was a powerful symbol of the deep disillusionment with traditional religious institutions. The flagellants were an embodiment of the fear, confusion and despair that the plague had brought to the European masses. As the flagellant movement gained momentum, another shift in religious thought began to emerge, one that would have a far-reaching impact on the future of Christianity. The crisis of faith caused by the plague inspired a growing number of people to question not just the Church's handling of the epidemic, but the very structure of church authority itself. Without a clear answer from the clergy, individuals began to turn inward, seeking personal salvation and questioning the legitimacy of the Church's monopoly on religious practice. In cities across Europe, groups of lay people began to form their own religious societies. These groups, often composed of the poor and disenfranchised, sought spiritual meaning outside of the traditional structures of the Church. They practiced forms of piety that emphasized personal connection with God, without the need for a priest or intermediary. The belief in personal salvation became more widespread as people began to lose faith in the idea that the Church was the only path to God's grace. One of the more prominent shifts during this time was the rise of mysticism, a movement that sought a direct, personal experience of God. Mystics such as Meister Eckhart and Catherine of Siena preached about the importance of the inner spiritual life, encouraging individuals to seek a personal union with the divine rather than relying solely on the Church's rituals and sacraments. Mysticism emphasized the importance of personal prayer and meditation rather than communal worship and external acts of penance. This form of spirituality resonated with many during the plague, as people found solace in the idea that they could have a direct relationship with God, even when the Church appeared to be failing them. These religious shifts laid the groundwork for later reformations within the Church. The idea that individuals could interpret the Bible and seek God's grace without relying on the priesthood set the stage for movements like the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. The belief in personal salvation and the rejection of church authority would come to define Protestant thought, and the dissatisfaction with the Catholic Church's response to the Black Death would contribute to the rise of reformist ideas. At the same time, the Church was not entirely passive in the face of these challenges. In some regions, religious leaders began to reform their practices and policies in an attempt to regain the trust of their flock. The concept of charitable works, helping the sick, the poor and the destitute, gained renewed importance. Hospitals, orphanages, and institutions dedicated to caring for those suffering from the plague began to receive more attention and funding from the Church. However, this reform was often too little, too late, and in many cases, the Church's ability to protect or heal its followers remained limited. The aftermath of the Black Death also saw a decline in the power of the clergy over the population. The Church's inability to prevent or mitigate the devastation of the plague caused many people to question its authority, and this distrust would reverberate through European society for generations. The Church's inability to provide an answer to the plague left a void that other forces, political, social and religious, would seek to fill. The concept of divine will, once used to justify church authority, became a tool for reformers who would later challenge the very structure of the Catholic Church itself. While the Black Death did not immediately lead to the Protestant Reformation, it acted as a catalyst for change in the religious landscape of Europe. It prompted a questioning of the established religious order, leading to the rise of new spiritual movements and philosophies that would eventually challenge the Church's dominance. The aftermath of the Black Death left an indelible mark on the Catholic Church, forcing it to confront a shift in both its spiritual and temporal authority. For centuries, the Church had been a central institution, guiding every facet of life from birth to death. But the plague, with its merciless spread and staggering death toll, challenged the very notion of divine protection and providence. As Europe slowly began to recover from the catastrophe, the Church faced not only the death of thousands of its clergy, but also the loss of its moral authority and influence over its followers. The growing dissatisfaction with the Church's inability to offer answers during the plague prompted a shift in religious thought. As many began to question the traditional view of divine retribution, new ideas about salvation and spirituality began to take root. The Church, grappling with its diminished role in the face of an overwhelming crisis, began to adapt to a changing world. But these efforts, though well-intentioned, would often be seen as insufficient in light of the widespread disillusionment. One of the key responses of the Catholic Church was to emphasize personal piety. While the Church had once been seen as the sole path to salvation, the devastation of the plague pushed many people to seek a more direct and personal relationship with God. The rise of mysticism, as seen with figures such as Meister Eckhart and Catherine of Siena, highlighted the growing desire for a more personal, experiential form of worship. These mystics encouraged individuals to turn inward, seeking communion with God through prayer and meditation, rather than through the external rituals and ceremonies of the Church. Mysticism, which emphasized inner purity and divine connection, resonated with those who had seen the failure of the traditional Church during the plague. Simultaneously, the idea of charitable wassails became increasingly important in the Church's response. As the plague left entire communities in ruin, the Catholic Church took a more active role in providing for the poor, the sick, and the displaced. Hospitals and orphanages became more common, and the Church began to focus on its role in providing care and comfort to those suffering. The Church's charitable efforts were an attempt to restore its moral authority and to show the people that it had not abandoned them in their time of need. While this was a positive step in rebuilding the Church's reputation, it also underscored the Church's role as both a spiritual and social institution. This marked the beginning of a transformation in which the Church's duties expanded beyond religious services to include public welfare. However, despite these efforts, the Church was still unable to recover the influence it once held. The Black Death's destruction of entire communities, its levelling of the social order, and the disillusionment it caused among the faithful created an environment ripe for change. As the years passed, some began to seek alternatives to the established Church, which was increasingly seen as out of touch with the needs of its people. The rise of religious reform movements would lay the groundwork for the eventual Protestant Reformation, which would challenge the very structure of the Catholic Church and alter the religious landscape of Europe forever. The Black Death had opened a space for individual spirituality and personal religious practice, which would later become central to the Protestant Reformation. Reformers like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia began to argue that the Church had strayed too far from its original teachings, and that individuals should have more direct access to the Bible and to God without the mediation of the clergy. The idea that salvation could be achieved without the intercession of priests or indulgences was revolutionary, and gained traction as the Church's moral authority weakened. Meanwhile, the rise of humanism in the 15th century, spurred by the rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman texts, also influenced religious thought. Humanism emphasized the importance of the individual and the study of human nature, and many humanist thinkers began to advocate for a return to the original teachings of the Bible. The invention of the printing press in the 1440s played a pivotal role in the spread of these ideas, making religious texts more accessible to the common people and allowing reformers to challenge the Church's teachings in ways that were not previously possible. By the time of Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, the Catholic Church was already in the midst of a spiritual and intellectual crisis. The early calls for reform that emerged in the wake of the Black Death were now reaching a tipping point. Luther's challenge to the Church's sale of indulgences, and his call for a return to the principles of sola scriptura, scripture alone, resonated with a population that had already begun to question the Church's legitimacy. The Catholic Church's inability to adequately address the concerns raised by the Black Death and its aftermath contributed directly to the success of the Protestant Reformation, which would forever alter the course of European history. Despite the profound changes brought about by the Reformation, the legacy of the Black Death on the Church was long-lasting. The event marked a turning point in the relationship between the Church and the people of Europe. The crisis of faith brought on by the plague, coupled with the Church's perceived failure to provide answers, set the stage for a broader re-evaluation of religious authority. The Black Death had not only devastated Europe physically, but had also set in motion the changes that would lead to a more fragmented and diverse religious landscape. The Black Death's impact on religion was not just about the loss of life, but about the reshaping of how people viewed their relationship with God, the Church, and the world. It led to a shift from an institutionalized, hierarchical view of religion to one that emphasized personal connection, scripture, and individual spiritual experiences. Though the full consequences of this shift would not be felt for generations, the Black Death undeniably played a crucial role in the transformation of the Christian Church and the birth of new religious movements that would change the world forever. The Black Death did not just claim lives, it overwhelmed every aspect of society, including the basic act of burial. As the plague swept through Europe, the death toll became so staggering that communities struggled not only to care for the sick, but also to dispose of the bodies of the dead. Graveyards, once capable of accommodating the needs of small villages, now became overwhelmed by the sheer number of corpses. The capacity of burial grounds quickly became inadequate as entire families, neighbourhoods and villages fell victim to the disease. What followed was a desperate attempt to keep up with the rapid pace of death, leading to a profound shift in how people dealt with the dead and the rituals surrounding burial. The first signs of trouble were small at first. In towns where the plague first struck, local authorities attempted to maintain order as best they could. But as the disease spread rapidly, it became impossible to manage the bodies in the way people were accustomed to. In many places, funeral rites were simplified or abandoned altogether. The traditional process of burying the dead, carrying the bodies to the churchyard, having a priest perform last rites, and then lowering them into the earth, became impractical as the number of dead surged beyond the resources available. The lack of clergy, many of whom had succumbed to the disease themselves, only compounded the problem. Without enough priests to oversee the burial process, many bodies were disposed of hastily and without ceremony. In larger cities, the situation became even more dire. With the collapse of normal social structures, local governments and religious institutions were forced to make drastic decisions. The need to dispose of the dead was so pressing that in some places, mass graves were dug to accommodate the overwhelming number of bodies. These plague pits became a grim necessity, a temporary solution that spoke to the magnitude of the crisis. As the burial grounds filled, they began to overflow, forcing officials to use every available space they could find. Sometimes fields, public squares, and even the streets became sites for the mass burial of victims. The bodies, often unwashed and unattended, were stacked haphazardly, a tragic and visible symbol of society's inability to cope with the devastation. The sheer number of bodies created logistical nightmares. In the worst-hit cities, cartloads of corpses were brought to burial sites on a daily basis. The scale of death was so overwhelming that it required entire groups of workers, often labourers or the unemployed, to assist in the burial process. These individuals, many of whom were already struggling to survive, now found themselves in a position where they had to handle the bodies of the dead. The work was physically demanding and mentally taxing, with the workers themselves at constant risk of contracting the disease. The dead were often buried without ceremony. For many, the ability to mourn the loss of loved ones became secondary to the more immediate need to remove the bodies before they began to decompose. This lack of proper burial rites led to a sense of disconnection from death, with many survivors feeling that their loved ones had been denied the dignity of a proper farewell. The Catholic Church, which had long been the primary institution overseeing death rites, struggled to maintain its rituals in the face of such widespread death. The Church's role in administering funerals was severely compromised, and in some cases, the faithful were left without the comfort of last rites as priests either fled or died themselves. In addition to the physical and logistical challenges, the rapid disposal of bodies also raised profound spiritual and ethical questions. The lack of proper burials led to concerns about the souls of the dead. In medieval Christianity, the proper handling of a body and the performance of last rites were essential to ensure the soul's safe passage to the afterlife. Without these rites, many people feared that the souls of the deceased might not find peace. As the plague claimed the lives of so many, the idea of purgatory, a place where souls could be purified before reaching heaven, became a source of anxiety for the survivors. People began to panic that their loved ones might be trapped in purgatory forever because of the hastily conducted burials. The lack of proper funerary rituals also created a sense of collective trauma. Survivors often had to watch as entire communities were decimated, with little chance for closure or grief. The social fabric of medieval Europe, which had long been centred around family and community, was torn apart. People who had once been neighbours or relatives were now dead and buried, often without the comfort of a funeral procession or a memorial. In some cases, the dead were left to decay in the open, their bodies becoming a reminder of the plague's devastation. As communities struggled to bury the dead, the psychological toll on the living was immense. The sheer scale of the death toll created a sense of helplessness and despair. Many survivors, having lost family members, friends and neighbours, found it difficult to process their grief. The lack of funerary rites compounded this emotional distress, as people were unable to properly mourn their dead. Instead of communal gatherings to mourn and celebrate the lives of those lost, people were forced to live with the memory of bodies hastily buried in mass graves. The grieving process itself became a casualty of the plague. Despite the overwhelming death toll and the challenges faced by communities in managing the bodies of the dead, there were some who attempted to restore order to the burial process. In some areas, local authorities set aside special burial sites for the victims of the plague, hoping to avoid further contamination. These plague pits were often marked with rudimentary signs or crosses as a way of distinguishing them from other burial grounds. In the absence of traditional cemeteries, some people turned to alternative means of honouring the dead. These acts of defiance against the overwhelming tragedy of the plague highlighted the resilience of communities who, despite being ravaged by the disease, still sought to maintain some semblance of dignity in death. The burial process, with its disorganisation and lack of ritual, left deep scars on the survivors. The trauma of not being able to properly mourn or bury the dead would linger long after the plague passed. In many places, the very notion of death and burial was forever altered. Where once the dead were treated with reverence and buried according to tradition, the rapid and chaotic disposal of bodies during the plague left a lasting legacy of grief, loss, and uncertainty.